Hey. Welcome back to Monkey D, FIC. We've got something fire today. What if the world government executed all the emperors including Luffy? Likes and subs keep us going. Alright, story time. Chapter 1. The silencing. The morning they killed the emperors, the sea went quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles over water at dawn, the kind that makes fishermen breathe easy and children lean over the sides of boats to watch their own reflections. This was the other kind. The kind that comes before something enormous and irreversible tears the world apart at its seams. Even the seagulls had stopped their crying, as if they understood, on some animal level, that what was about to happen deserved silence. Marineford's plaza was packed so densely that the crowd had taken on a single breathing rhythm, a massive, collective inhale that hadn't quite found its exhale yet. The scaffold had been rebuilt, reinforced this time, with sea-stone bolts driven through every joint and crossbeam. Someone in the world government had clearly given instructions to an engineer who understood the difference between theatrical execution and actual structural necessity. The platform stood 15 feet off the ground, visible from every angle of the plaza and from the decks of the 17 marine warships anchored in the bay. 5 chairs. 5 sets of restraints. And 5 people who, between them, had spent decades being the reason most of the world slept nervously at night. Kaido sat in the chair on the far left with his eyes closed, and even now, even in chains so thick they would have snapped a lesser man's shoulders out of their sockets, he radiated something that made the Marines assigned to guard him keep shuffling backward by increments they probably didn't notice themselves doing. The sea-stone cuffs had stripped him of his devil fruit, reduced him to the purely physical, and the purely physical version of Kaido was still a creature that looked like it had been assembled from geology rather than biology. There were dried cuts across his forearms from where he had tested the restraints 3 times during transport. The cuts had stopped bleeding before the ship docked. He hadn't tried a 4th time. Not because he'd given up, the Marines monitoring him had gradually, collectively realized this over the preceding hours, but because he was thinking. Kaido was always most dangerous when he went quiet. To his right, Charlotte Linlin, Big Mom, had been crying since they brought her aboard the transport vessel 2 days prior. Not from fear. From something rawer and more complicated than fear. She kept asking about her children, repeating names in a low, rhythmic murmur, and the Marine lieutenant who had been foolish enough to tell her, on day 1, that her family would be fine had spent the subsequent 48 hours with both arms in splints. She'd broken them through the restraints on pure reflex. They'd doubled the sea-stone dosage after that. Now she sat massive and diminished at once, her hair wild, her eyes red, and every few minutes she said a name, Katakuri, Perispero, pudding, in a voice that had nothing maternal about it and everything maternal about it simultaneously. Edward Newgate's seat was empty. Whitebeard was already dead. He'd been dead for years. The world government, apparently, had decided to acknowledge the fact that he no longer required a chair, which was almost considerate of them by their standards. Blackbeard, Marshal D. Teach, occupied the middle chair and appeared to be asleep. Or performing sleep, which was a distinction with Blackbeard that had always been difficult to parse. His massive chest rose and fell with theatrical steadiness. There was dried food in his beard. 2 of the Marines standing watch over him were visibly disgusted, and one had moved upwind. His wrists were in 4 separate sets of sea-stone cuffs, the most of any prisoner present, because someone in Fleet Admiral Akainu's intelligence division had actually done their reading on what Blackbeard could do when he had 2 active devil fruits running simultaneously and had communicated their concerns in writing, in triplicate, with a cover letter. And at the far right, in the last chair, was Monkey D. Luffy. He was looking at the crowd. Not with defiance, not with the focused fury that people who had faced him in battle described afterward when they were trying to explain how someone that reckless and rubber-boned had beaten them. He was just looking, the way he always looked at things that interested him, with open, uncomplicated attention, his dark eyes moving across the packed plaza and the warships and the scaffold's wooden grain and the sky above everything, which was the particular blue of early morning that exists for maybe 20 minutes before the day fully commits to itself. His arms were behind him. sea stone manacles at both wrists and both ankles, and a collar around his neck that connected by a short chain to the back of the chair. He was wearing what he'd been wearing when they caught him, the same red vest, the same shorts, the same sandals, now scuffed and salt-stained from the transport. His hat was gone. They'd taken it in processing. He hadn't said anything about that yet, but one of the Marine guards near him, a young woman, barely out of training, standing at a precise distance that her supervisor had designated as safe, and which she privately felt was not nearly far enough, had noticed that he kept glancing, very briefly and without real urgency, toward the corner of the scaffold where a Marine officer was standing with the hat hanging from 2 fingers, as if unsure what to do with it. Luffy looked at the crowd again. Then he smiled, small and private, like he'd just worked something out. Fleet Admiral Sakazuki stood at the edge of the upper balcony overlooking the plaza and watched the scaffold with the expression of a man reviewing completed paperwork. He had been called many things over the course of his career: brutal, righteous, relentless, monstrous, depending on who was doing the calling and from which side of a very clear line they stood, but the thing that most of his subordinates found, privately and in the small honest space inside themselves they visited when they were alone, most unsettling about him was not his power. It was that he was never theatrical about it. He never enjoyed things loudly. He experienced the rightness of things with a kind of cold, interior satisfaction that was somehow worse to be near than simple cruelty would have been. He turned to the man beside him. Timeline. Vice Admiral Doberman checked his pocket watch. 14 minutes, Fleet Admiral. Sakazuki nodded once and returned his gaze to the scaffold. Behind him, separated by 6 feet of deliberate distance that they had not been told to maintain but had arrived at by mutual instinct, Admiral Fujitora stood with his cane planted firmly against the stone and his blindfolded face angled toward the plaza below. His expression was the expression of a man listening to something unpleasant that he had nonetheless chosen not to walk away from. The distinction between those two things, cannot leave versus chooses to stay, had been occupying a significant portion of his attention for the past several days. Fleet Admiral, he said. Sakazuki didn't turn. Isho. The younger one's crew is still unaccounted for. If they attempt, they won't reach the plaza in time. Sakazuki said it the way he said most things, not dismissively, but with the weight of a conclusion reached through actual calculation rather than optimism. The blockade is holding. Admiral Kizaru's unit intercepted their fastest ship 3 hours ago. They're not coming. Fujitora's cane pressed a little harder against the stone. He said nothing else. What he was thinking, he kept precisely where Sakazuki couldn't reach it. 3,000 miles from Marineford, Roronoa Zoro was fighting a man who was very good with an axe. The island was called Briar, and it was the kind of island that maps marked with a small triangle and a warning notation about currents rather than a name, which meant it was the kind of island where things happen that the world government preferred not to have neat records of. It was all cliffs and scrub pine and salt-eaten rock, with a small harbor that the Thousand Sunny had limped into 2 days prior after the encounter with Kizaru's advanced ships had taken out the mainsail and cracked the figurehead. They'd put in for repairs. They'd sent Chopper and Usopp into the nearest village, not a real village, more a collection of people who had all independently decided that being hard to find was worth the inconvenience, for supplies. Zoro had gone to sleep under a pine tree on the eastern cliff because the angle of it caught a consistent breeze and the sound of the ocean below was good to sleep to. He'd woken up to someone trying to take his swords. The man with the axe, who had introduced himself, during the initial part of the altercation that had included talking, as Garrett, and who was apparently one of 6 brothers who made a living on the island stealing from ships that put in for emergency repairs, which was a solid enough business model in theory, was fast. Actually fast, not just fast for a man his size, which was considerable. The axe moved in figure-8 patterns that were designed to be disorienting, and Zoro could see from the first 2 exchanges that the weight distribution of the strikes was intended to batter through guard rather than slip around it. Good mechanics. Wrong opponent. Zoro had Wado Ikemanji in his right hand and Sandai Kitetsu in his left, and he'd left Enma sheathed because the situation didn't call for Enma. He stepped into the third axe swing instead of back from it, let the handle take the impact against his cross blades rather than the head, and had his knee in Garrett's stomach before the bigger man could correct his balance. Garrett folded. Zoro stepped over him and kept walking toward the cliff edge. "Stay down," he said, not looking back. "I'm not in the mood." He wasn't in any particular mood, actually. That was the thing about Zoro that most people, meeting him for the first time in a situation like this, interpreted as menace and would have been surprised to learn was simply the baseline state of a man who existed almost entirely in the present tense. Whatever was happening right now was the only thing that was happening. He sat back down on the cliff, propped his back against the pine tree's trunk, crossed his arms, and closed his eyes. From somewhere below and to his left, he heard the sound of Garrett, and apparently, a variable number of brothers, deciding to go find something easier to steal. He slept for another hour. When he woke up, it was because the den mushi on his belt had started making a sound it had never made before. The den mushi broadcast system, the one they'd patched together during the last 3 weeks using components Frankie had sourced from a marine relay station they'd visited, was capable of receiving signals from almost any frequency if you knew the adjustment sequence. Frankie had written the sequence on a piece of paper and given copies to every crew member on the grounds that if he was ever indisposed someone else should be able to work the thing, and Zoro had immediately lost his copy. But the basic principle was that certain world government emergency frequencies, when broadcast at maximum power, could bleed into their receiver range. The frequency bleeding now was a world government signal. Maximum power. Zoro stared at the small snail, which was sitting up very straight and making the face it made when it was receiving something it found significant, and then he pressed the activation point on the shell and held it to his ear. The voice that came through was not a news announcer. It was an official Marine press officer, female, trained to clarity, and she was reading from a prepared statement in the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment, and still found it, in practice, somewhat larger than expected. In accordance with World Government Resolution 1109, authorizing the emergency suppression of existential threats to global security, the following sentence has been carried out in full. The execution of 4 individuals classified as Yonko, Emperors of the Sea, including Shanks, known as Red-Haired Shanks, Charlotte Lin, known as Big Mom, Marshall D. Teach, known as Blackbeard, and Monkey D. Luffy, known as the Straw Hat, has been completed at 0700 hours at Marine Headquarters, Marineford. The world government wishes to assure all citizens. Zoro lowered the den mushi from his ear. He set it down on the rock beside him very carefully, the way you set down a glass that is very full and very fragile and that you are not going to pick up again immediately. The sea below the cliff was doing what it always did. The pines behind him moved in the wind. A bird crossed the sky from east to southwest without hurrying. He sat there for a while. Then he picked up the den mushi, clipped it back to his belt, stood up, and walked back toward the harbor. The Thousand Sunny was quiet when he got there, which told him before he saw any of their faces that they had heard it too. Nami was sitting on the deck with her back against the main mast and her knees drawn up and her cartography instruments in her lap, none of which she was using. She was staring at nothing in particular at the mid-distance, and her face had the look it had sometimes when she was doing math in her head, except the math this time clearly wasn't adding up to anything she could navigate by. Usopp was standing at the bow, both hands on the railing, facing out to sea. His shoulders were doing something complicated. Robin was sitting in her reading chair, which she had somehow moved to the deck, with a book closed on her lap and her eyes open and very still, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who had survived enough of the world's worst moments to know exactly what this one tasted like. Chopper was crying openly, without pretense, in the way that children and people who have stopped caring about the difference between public and private emotion do, which was in his case both of those things at once. He had his hooves over his face, and his little shoulders were shaking. Brooks sat at the stern with his violin across his knees and wasn't playing it. Sanji was leaning against the galley door with a cigarette that had burned down to nothing without him taking a drag. Frankie had his sunglasses on. They couldn't tell what he was doing with his face behind them. Zoro walked onto the deck. He looked at all of them. You heard, Nami said. Not a question. Yeah. Nobody said anything for a moment. The harbor water moved against the Sunny's hull in the specific rhythm it had, familiar now after months, a sound so associated with being on this ship and being this crew that Zoro felt it the same way he felt his own heartbeat, something he only noticed when he was paying specific attention to it. They said Shanks too, Usopp said, still facing the water. His voice was trying to stay level and mostly succeeding except for a seam near the end of the sentence. I know. They said the four emperors. Shanks and Big Mom and Blackbeard and Luffy. All four. At the same time. Usopp turned around. His eyes were red. How do you even do that? How does the world government do all four of that simultaneously? That's Zoro, that's Shanks. How do you capture Shanks? They prepared for years. Robin said quietly. Her voice was perfectly even. The Void Protocol. I've read about the theoretical basis in world government infrastructure documents. Seastone gas dispersal, coordinated admiral deployment, and a distraction framework so comprehensive that none of the four targets could call for aid in time. She paused. They were going to do it eventually. I always suspected they were going to do it eventually. The emperors maintained a balance that made the world government necessary. Remove the emperors, remove the threat. That's how they see it. That's not how it works, Nami said. No, Robin agreed. It's not. Zoro stopped in the middle of the deck and looked at the mast, and then at the sky, and then at his hands. He was carrying Wado Ikemanji's sheath, the blade still loose from the cliff. He pushed it home until it clicked. We're going to Marineford, he said. Nami looked at him. Zoro, I didn't say today. I said we're going. He sat down on a coil of rope. Eventually. After we figure out what's happening in the rest of the world. After we know what the government is doing next. He pulled one knee up and rested his arm on it. He's not. He stopped. He started again. He told me something once, early on, when I'd been with the crew long enough that it wasn't a shock anymore, but not so long that everything had settled into normal. He said that he wasn't afraid of dying. He said the thing that would be terrible was dying before he got to the end. The getting to the end was the part he cared about. Zoro looked at the deck planks. He laughed when he said it. Of course he laughed. He laughs at everything. His voice didn't change. He didn't get to the end. No one spoke. So we do, Zoro said. We get to the end. For him. Chopper took his hooves off his face. Usopp dragged his sleeve across his eyes. Nami finally moved, unfolding her knees and standing up, and her face had changed from whatever it had been before into something harder and more navigable, something she could actually use. We need information, she said. Before anything else, we need to know what's happening everywhere. The power vacuum is going to start filling immediately. Smaller crews, former subordinates, anyone who thinks the seat is empty. And if the government is running some secondary operation on top of the executions, we need to know what it is before it reaches us. Law, Robin said. Nami looked at her. What? Trafalgar Law. He wasn't classified as an emperor. His bounty is high, but he fell below the threshold they were targeting. He's alive, and he has intelligence resources we don't have access to. If anyone knows what the world government's secondary objectives are, it's him. Robin's fingers settled on her closed book. He also has every reason to cooperate. He understood what the balance of power was keeping in check. With the emperors gone, his own position becomes considerably more dangerous. Zoro looked at Robin for a moment. You know where he is? I know where he tends to be when the world goes sideways. The ghost of something that might have been a dry smile. The same place all sensible people go when something this large happens. Somewhere with very good walls and no easy approach. Can you reach him? I can try. Do that. Zoro stood up. Frankie. How long on the repairs? Frankie pushed his sunglasses up. His jaw was set. 6 hours if I push it. 8 if I want to do it right. Do it right. Frankie nodded and disappeared toward the hull without another word. Back at Marineford, in the 3 minutes and 40 seconds between the press officer finishing the prepared statement and the crowd in the plaza beginning to make the noise that mobs make when the thing they've been building toward has finally happened, Monkey D. Luffy had been looking at the sky. He'd been looking at the sky since they led them up the steps, because the sky above Marineford at 0700 was exactly that specific blue, and he wanted to have a good look at it. He looked at worse things and he looked at better things, and looking at the sky had always been something that felt like it was worth doing properly when you had the chance. The Marine guard near him, the young woman he'd noticed earlier, the one standing at the designated safe distance, had watched him look at the sky for most of the walk up the steps and most of the sitting down and most of the speech, and she'd found herself in the grip of an emotion she couldn't quite name, something between profound discomfort and something that wasn't quite admiration but lived in the same neighborhood. He turned his head and looked at her directly, and she flinched, because people always flinched a little when Luffy looked at them directly, and she'd assumed she would be different. "Hey," he said. She said nothing. Protocol. Her training had covered this exact kind of provocation, prisoners attempting to humanize themselves prior to execution as a psychological last resort, and she was a good Marine who knew her training, and she maintained her silence. "You look nervous," Luffy said conversationally, without any apparent agenda. "You don't have to be nervous. Nothing bad is going to happen to you." She found that she wanted to point out the fundamental absurdity of the King of the Pirates, the soon-to-be-executed King of the Pirates, reassuring her about her safety, but her training covered that too, and she said nothing. "I know you guys think this is over," he said. "I know that's what you think this is. Because you got us, and now there's no more pirates and everything calms down." He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded like a man explaining something he found genuinely interesting. "But you know what the thing is about the sea? You can't make the sea quiet. You can make the surface smooth for a while, and it looks really flat and calm, and then something moves underneath and the whole surface changes. You can't stop that. The sea does what it does." The head executioner signaled. The young Marine guard stared straight ahead. "The thing I want," Luffy said, and his voice hadn't changed at all. It was still that open, unhurried, interested voice. "Is for everybody to be free. For the people on the sea to be free, and the people on the islands to be free, and even the people in the Marines to be free, actually, because some of them don't look like they want to be there. That's the thing I want." A short pause. "Nobody can execute a want. Just so you know." The blade came down. The world heard it happen before it understood what it was hearing, the way you hear thunder before you've registered that the sky has gone dark. The Den Mushi broadcast carried it everywhere simultaneously. The world government had made sure of that, had wanted the moment to be total and undeniable, had understood that a secret execution would breed conspiracy theories while a public one would breed a different kind of fear, the kind that was actually useful. What they had not fully calculated, or had calculated and dismissed, was what happens when you remove 5 specific stones from an arch. Not the biggest stones. Not the ones on the outside that everyone can see. The ones near the center that the whole structure is quietly, invisibly pressing against. Remove those and the arch doesn't weaken. It falls. And then the rubble is something else entirely. In the Wano region, 6 of Kaido's former subordinate commanders stood in a room and had a conversation that ended with 2 of them dead, and the other 4 in agreement about something that would take 2 weeks to fully assemble but would, when assembled, be pointed directly at the nearest Marine base. In Tada Land, Charlotte Katakuri stood on the ruined ramparts of Whole Cake Island, ruined from the last fight, still partially repaired, and heard the broadcast on a stolen Marine Den Mushi, and his jaw tightened by a single degree, and he turned to his siblings and said 4 words that the youngest of them would repeat in later years when asked what started everything. "We eat them last." In the Revolutionary Army's headquarters, a man in a white feathered coat stood at a window with his back to a room full of people waiting for him to say something. He stood like that for a long time. Then he said, "Begin Phase 1. And turned around, and his face was the face of someone who had decided they were finished deciding things slowly. His name was Sabo. He had his brother's smile, slightly bent. He used it rarely. He didn't use it now. In a Marine barracks room on the third floor of a building adjacent to Marineford's main administrative complex, a junior officer named Taggart, 22 years old, from a small island in the East Blue, a good Marine by every metric that the system used to evaluate good Marines, sat down on his bunk and stared at the opposite wall for a long time. He joined the Marines because of the idea. Not the organization, not the uniform, not the pay grade, but the actual idea that there was good and bad in the world and that there were people who stood between innocent people and the bad, and that being one of those people was the right thing to be. It was a simple idea. He'd been young enough when he joined that simple ideas were the most persuasive kind. He'd been at the plaza. He'd been in the rows of standing Marines, at attention, watching the scaffold. He'd heard what the prisoner in the last chair had said to the guard nearby. He hadn't been close enough to catch all of it, but he'd caught pieces, and what he'd caught had been sitting in his chest since the blades felt like something that needed to be coughed out but wouldn't quite come. Nobody can execute a want. He didn't know what to do with that. He genuinely didn't know what to do with it. He was a Marine. He believed in his institution. The emperors had terrorized the seas for decades, had wrecked islands, had extorted populations, had left trails of death and destruction across every ocean. Getting rid of them was, by any straightforward accounting, a good thing. He believed that. He kept believing it, sitting on the bunk. He just couldn't get the sky out of his head. The way the prisoner had been looking at the sky. Not scared. Not performing courage, the way people performed courage when they were actually scared. Just looking at the sky because it was worth looking at. He got up, eventually, and went back to work. He was a good Marine. He did his duty. But the thing in his chest didn't go anywhere. By midday, Marineford was in the grip of a specific institutional energy that Sakazuki recognized from past large operations, the clean, efficient hum of a machine that has done what it was designed to do and is now looking for its next task. Reports were coming in from every ocean. The immediate reactions, small riots in pirate-sympathetic ports, some protests in districts under heavy Yonko influence, 2 minor Marine bases experiencing low-level civil unrest outside their gates, were all within projected parameters. Nothing that couldn't be contained. He stood in his office with the ocean visible through the window behind him, reading the parameter reports one by one, and the satisfaction he felt was real and grounded. Not pride. Something more foundational. The world had been an equation with too many variables on the wrong side. He had reduced the variables. This was what order looked like in the making. Uncomfortable, up close. Correct, at distance. Fujitora appeared in the doorway without knocking, which was a habit that Sakazuki had never formally objected to because the mathematics of formally objecting to something Fujitora did involved its own set of complications. The reactions are within parameters, Sakazuki said, without turning from the window. Some of them are. Fujitora's cane tapped into the room. Others are not. Sakazuki set down the report in his hand. Specify. Wano. Tado land. The Revolutionary Army's 3 eastern cells have gone dark simultaneously, which intelligence indicates is not a sign of inactivity but of coordinated movement. Fujitora stopped in the middle of the office. And the straw hats? The surviving crew? They haven't scattered. They'll scatter. No. Fujitora said it simply, without argument. They won't. I've read every intelligence profile on those 8 people, and the one consistent thing across every observation is that they don't scatter. They are not the type. He turned his blindfolded face toward Sakazuki with the kind of accuracy that still, after years, produced an involuntary awareness in anyone he aimed it at. We have done something this morning that will be very difficult to undo. We don't need to undo it. No. We will need to survive what comes from it. Fujitora's cane pressed against the floor once, firmly. And I want it on record, Fleet Admiral, that my concerns about the secondary operations, the extended bounty escalations, the proposed civilian detention protocols, those concerns remain active. Noted. Sakazuki picked up the next report. Fujitora stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked out. Sakazuki listened to the cane tap its way down the corridor, and he turned back to the window and the sea, and he looked at it the way a general looks at a map, with interest and calculation and without sentiment, and he began building, in the organized architecture of his mind, the next phase of what he intended to do. He had won today. He knew that. But he had also been doing this long enough to know that winning and finishing were two different things, and that the distance between them was where most catastrophes lived. He would not let that distance become catastrophic. He would move fast, and hard, and with purpose, and the world would become the thing it was supposed to be. He had decided this years ago. Days like today were just the mechanism. The deciding was already done. He looked at the sea. The sea looked back. Somewhere on it, 8 people and a ship that should have scattered weren't scattering, and a man with tattoos and 3 swords was sitting on a coil of rope deciding something with the same kind of finality that Sakazuki himself used, and neither of them yet knew that they were, in the most fundamental sense, the same kind of person aimed at opposite ends of the same question. What does the world owe the free? What does freedom owe the world? The sea had its opinion. It always did. It was keeping it, for now, underneath the surface, where the current moved in directions that the smoothness above gave no indication of. The young Marine guard from the plaza sat in the barracks 2 floors below Sakazuki's office and held a cup of tea that had gone cold, and thought about the sky, and about wants that couldn't be executed, and didn't know yet that she was part of the answer to both questions. The blade had fallen. The question had just begun. Chapter 2. What remains? The island of Briar smelled like pine resin and low tide, and by the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn the morning mist off the cliffs, the Thousand Sunnies repairs were half done and the crew had stopped crying and started being angry, which was, in the particular emotional vocabulary of this crew, a form of progress. Nami had commandeered the NAV table in the lower cabin and spread 3 charts across it, weighing the corners with whatever was closest: a compass, a coffee mug, Usopp's goggles, the hilt of a dagger she'd appropriated from somewhere without explanation. She was plotting things that weren't navigation routes, not yet, because you couldn't navigate somewhere until you knew what the something was that you were navigating toward. What she was actually doing was building a picture of the world as it now existed, using the information coming through the patched receiver and the knowledge she'd accumulated across 2 years of sailing through every kind of trouble the Grand Line had to offer. The picture was not good. But it was a picture, and having a picture was better than not having one, so she kept building it. Robin sat across from her with a cup of tea and contributed information at intervals, the kind of information that didn't come from maps or broadcasts, but from years of reading things that most people didn't know existed. She mentioned troop movements that the Marine broadcasts weren't reporting. She described, calmly and without drama, the infrastructure the world government had quietly been building over the preceding 3 years, the secondary detention facilities, the expanded intelligence network, the reclassification of bounty tiers that had happened in a memo rather than a public announcement, and which had the practical effect of putting significantly more people in the execute on sight category than the capture and process 1. They were planning this for a long time, Nami said, not looking up from her chart. Yes. The Void Protocol. The simultaneous capture. That's not something you assemble in 6 months. Nami drew a line between 2 points, studied it, erased it. They've been building toward this. The executions were the visible part. What do they do next, Robin? That's what I need to know. Robin turned her teacup slowly in both hands. They fill the vacuum before anyone else can. Secondary targets. People with the potential to become what the emperors were. High bounty pirates, revolutionary commanders, anyone with a fleet large enough to be an alternative power center. She set the cup down. And then they start on the islands. The ones that were under emperor protection. Tato Land, Wano, the territories around Elbaf. With the emperors gone, Those populations have no deterrent force standing between them and whatever the world government decides to do with them. Nami was quiet for a moment. How long before the secondary operations start? They may have already started. Nami put her pencil down. She picked it up again. She was not someone who let herself be paralyzed by information, not even information this heavy, but she was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that what she was feeling right now was not ordinary analytical stress. It was the specific sensation of the ground having shifted, of the map she'd been using to understand where she was being replaced by a different map without her consent. She thought about Luffy for exactly 4 seconds. The way he'd always known where he was going even when he had no idea what direction he was heading. The way the destination had always been less important to him than the going. The way he made everyone around him feel like the going was enough, was actually the whole point, was in fact the best thing about being alive. She picked up her pencil and went back to the chart. Then we move before they do, she said. We need Law. We need whatever intelligence he's sitting on. And we need to figure out what Sabo is doing before he does it in a way that makes everything harder. Robin almost smiled. When has Sabo ever done anything in a way that made things easier? That's why I want to know what he's doing before he does it, Nami said. So we can be somewhere useful when the fire starts. Zoro was on the upper deck when the Sunny's secondary Den Mushi, the small one, the one with the encoded frequency that only a handful of people in the world had access to, started ringing. He looked at it. It rang again, the small snail making its urgent face, its eyes extended as far as they'd go, which on this particular Den Mushi was further than average because Frankie had made modifications. Zoro picked it up. There was a brief silence on the other end, the particular silence of an encrypted connection establishing itself, and then a voice he recognized, flat and precise and carrying the specific dryness of a man who found most things faintly beneath his intelligence but engaged with them anyway. You're not dead, Law said. You either. They weren't targeting me. My bounty fell below their threshold by an amount that I find either fortunate or insulting, depending on the day. A pause. Are you going somewhere stupid? Probably. Marie Ford. Eventually. Another pause longer. Zoro could hear the ambient sounds of wherever Law was, wind, the creak of a ship, water. Moving then. Already at sea. I have information, Law said. Not all of it good. Some of it actively bad. I need to share it with someone who won't panic, and the list of people who qualify is currently very short. Where are you? South Blue. 3 days from your position if your ship is functional. A beat. Is your ship functional? Frankie's working on it. I'll take that as a qualified yes. There's an island, Trist, it's not on most civilian charts. Shallow water approach from the east, the harbor's on the northern. Send the coordinates to Robin, Zoro said. She'll find it. A silence that managed to convey something approximately like respect without making any of the sounds associated with respect. Fine. 3 days. Come alone if you can. We won't come alone. No. I know. Law's voice had something in it that wasn't quite tiredness, and wasn't quite grief but lived somewhere adjacent to both. Bring the navigator. And the archaeologist. Leave the ones who are going to make things difficult behind. We're all going to make things difficult. Yes, Law said. That is, unfortunately, what I expected. He disconnected. Zoro held the Den Mushi for a moment, then set it back on the railing and looked out at the harbor water. Frankie was somewhere below the waterline making noises with metal tools. The pines moved on the cliffs. Somewhere in the village, Sanji had apparently found a market, because the smell of something cooking had been drifting from the direction of shore for the past 20 minutes, which meant Sanji had decided, in the particular way that Sanji processed grief, through his hands, through feeding people, through the physical act of making something nourishing out of raw components, that the crew needed to eat. He was right. They did. Zoro went below and told Nami about Law. She listened, asked 2 sharp questions, got one answer she'd expected and one she hadn't, and immediately began adjusting her charts. Robin was already looking at a secondary map of the South Blue before Nami finished talking. He went back up to the deck, sat on his rope coil, and did not think about Luffy. He thought about what Luffy would have said, which was a different thing, because it was instructional rather than sentimental, and Zoro was built for instruction. Luffy would have said something simple. Something so obvious it was almost embarrassing. He'd have said, "So we go and fix it," with that slight tilt of the head that meant he'd already moved on from the problem statement to the doing of the thing, that the gap between identification and action was so small for him it barely existed. "So we go and fix it." Zoro closed his eyes. The wind off the cliffs was cold, and tasted like salt. Good. He needed the cold. He needed something physical and present to replace the thing in his chest that kept wanting to be something he didn't have time for right now. "We go and fix it." He opened his eyes. The sky was clear and very blue. He looked at it for a while, the way you look at something someone else taught you was worth looking at, and then he got up and went to help Frankie with the repairs. The news reached Toto Land by mid-afternoon, carried first by a marine broadcast that someone on the coast had intercepted, then by word of mouth through the candy architecture corridors of Whole Cake Island in the specific way that catastrophic news moved through populations, fast, fragmented, gathering mass as it went until it hit the center and stopped, suddenly, with the weight of something that had nowhere left to travel. Charlotte Katakuri was in the eastern courtyard doing what he always did in the early afternoon, which was training, because Katakuri's approach to uncertainty had always been to get stronger, which was a response to uncertainty that had the virtue of being consistently productive regardless of what the uncertainty turned out to be. He was working through a sequence of hockey-enhanced strikes against a stone formation he'd set up himself, each strike precise, each one a degree harder than the last, the kind of training that would have broken a lesser person's hands by the 15th repetition. He was on the 43rd when his younger sister Flamp appeared at the courtyard entrance, and he knew from the sound of her footsteps. She walked differently when she was frightened, faster and lighter, like she was trying to cover ground before her courage gave out, that whatever she was bringing him was real. He stopped. Turned. She told him. He stood there and heard it. He was a man who had spent his entire life developing the ability to see what was coming before it arrived, and he had not seen this coming, and the not seeing of it was something he registered as a pure clean fact before anything else reached him. Then the other things reached him, his mother's name in the broadcast. The word executed. The word Marie Ford. "The others?" he said. "The commanders are assembling in the main hall. Perispero is, he's not handling it well. Montdior is trying to get information from the marine frequency, but there's interference, and the islands," Katakuri said. He wasn't looking at Flamp. He was looking past her, at the specific middle distance where he looked when he was seeing things that hadn't happened yet. "Which marine ships are within range of our waters right now?" Flamp blinked. I don't know, I didn't find out." His voice was completely even. "Go to the communications room, find out every marine vessel within 2 days' approach, and bring me the list. Don't tell anyone what you're doing. Just go." She went. Katakuri turned back to his stone formation. He looked at it for a moment, then hit it once more, harder than any of the previous 43, and the stone split cleanly down the center, and both halves fell. He'd known his mother would die someday. Everyone died. He'd also known, in the way you know things you never say aloud, that the structure of power that kept Toto Land safe was inseparable from his mother's being alive and terrifying. Remove the terror, remove the structure. Remove the structure, and what you had was a large island with significant food resources and a population of devil fruit users, and nothing between it and a world government that had just demonstrated it was willing to do the largest, boldest thing anyone had imagined it doing in 100 years. He was not going to let that happen. He picked up the other half of the stone formation, carried it to the opposite wall, set it down, and went to the main hall to manage his siblings. He'd grieve later. He was good at later. He put things in later and they stayed there until he had the capacity to look at them, and then he looked at them, and then he kept moving. It was not a healthy system. It was his system, and it had kept him functional in situations that would have ended most people, so he was keeping it. He walked down the corridor, and his jaw was set and his eyes were forward, and if any of the passing servants noticed that his hands, inside his coat, were very briefly shaking before they stopped, nobody said anything. Sabo moved through the Revolutionary Army's eastern headquarters like weather, not loud, not violent, just impossible to stay in one place when he was in the room. He'd been awake for 31 hours. He didn't look it. He'd inherited something from his father, from Garp's bloodline through Dragon and down to the generation that was supposed to be different, and part of that inheritance was the particular physiological stubbornness that expressed itself as an almost offensive ability to function on inadequate sleep during emergencies. He stood at the head of the war room table with Koala on his right and Chief of Staff Bello Betty on his left, and the rest of the commanders arranged around the table in the approximate order of how useful they currently were. Phase 1 is moving, Bello Betty said. The East Blue cells are activated. West Blue is 48 hours behind. Grand Line cells are complicated. The government is watching the Grand Line cells specifically, Koala said. She had a stack of intelligence reports that she had been sorting with quiet efficiency since they'd gotten the news, because Koala processed crisis through competence, through making the information manageable, through being the most organized person in the room. It was how she'd survived this long. Any cell that moves too obviously is going to get flagged. We need them to move sideways. Pressure the marine outposts, disrupt supply lines, give civilian populations visible reasons to question the narrative. Don't engage directly. Yet, Sabo said. Koala looked at him. Sabo, I said yet. Not never. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the map. His burned scar pulled at the corner of his left eye, which it always did when he was thinking hard and had stopped maintaining the neutral expression. The government is going to accelerate. The executions bought them something: momentum, international credibility, the appearance of control. They're going to spend that currency fast, before the world has time to process what it actually means. Secondary targets, said a commander near the end of the table, a broad, serious man named Lindbergh, who had an engineer's habit of getting directly to mechanism. They'll go for high-value pirates next. Anyone with a fleet. Anyone in the ranking system who might become the next emperor. And our commanders, Bello Betty said quietly. If they can roll up the Revolutionary Army in the same window, they eliminate every organized opposition force simultaneously. Then we don't give them a window. Sabo straightened. Lindbergh, the weapons caches in Dressrosa and Arabasta. Status? Dressrosa is operational. Arabasta had a supply interruption, but Vivi's people sorted it 3 weeks ago. At the mention of Vivi's name, a small something crossed Sabo's face. Gone in a second. Good. Keep Arabasta offline for now, that location is too important to expose. Dressrosa can move. He turned to Koala. I need a contact. The Straw Hats? She already knew the answer. They're the only crew that has the reach and the profile to do what needs doing and the complete structural inability to be incorporated into any organized plan, which is actually what makes them useful right now. He almost smiled, and it was the slightly bent version, and it was gone fast. Nami. Get me Nami. Or Robin if Nami's busy. They're in the South Blue, last signal. Koala was already pulling a small den mushy from her coat. Probably moving. Find them. He moved away from the table, toward the window, because he needed to look at something that wasn't the map for a second, and outside the window was the gray-green roughness of the sea that surrounded the headquarters, and he looked at it the way you look at something that reminds you of a person. Ace had loved the sea the way most people loved a home they'd chosen rather than been born into, with the particular intensity of chosen things. Luffy had loved it the way he loved everything, totally, immediately, without self-consciousness, like it had never occurred to him that there was any other correct response to the ocean. Sabo had always loved it more quietly, from a sideways angle, the way he loved most things that he couldn't protect. He stood at the window for 10 seconds. Then he turned back around and was in motion again, and his face was the face of someone who had finished the portion of the day that was for feeling and was now in the portion that was for doing, and the doing was something large and specific and aimed at the people who had made today necessary. "Begin Phase 1, he said. "And someone get me Straw Hat's navigator." The broadcast played on repeat across every major island in every ocean for the remainder of the day, the world government's press office maintaining what was clearly an intentional saturation strategy. Keep the information in circulation, let it normalize, let the world arrive at acceptance through sheer repetitive familiarity with the fact of it. It was a sophisticated approach to public information management, and it worked up to a point. The point where it stopped working was a bar in the port district of Logue Town, where approximately 40 people who should not have been in the same room at the same time had independently arrived to get drunk in response to the news and had collectively discovered that being drunk with 40 pirates of varying allegiance and disposition in a room where the same broadcast was playing for the 17th time in 6 hours was a situation with a specific and inevitable social physics. The fight started over something unrelated to the executions, a spilled drink, an insult about someone's ship, and escalated into something that absolutely was about the executions, just displaced, the way grief often displaces itself into the nearest available outlet that has the right shape for hitting. By the time the local Marine Patrol arrived, the bar was on fire, 12 men were unconscious, and the remaining 28 had somehow arrived through the specific logic of people who have been fighting side by side against a common threat, at a temporary and extremely unstable alliance. The Marine Patrol looked at the burning bar and the 28 pirates and made the decision, collectively and without discussion, to go get reinforcements before engaging. The 28 pirates stood in the street outside the burning bar in the orange light and looked at each other. "So what do we do?" one of them said. Nobody had an answer for that yet. But the question itself, "What do we do?" was spreading across the world in the same way the broadcast was, finding harbor in different kinds of people. The ones who had sailed under the Emperor's flags, the ones who had merely benefited from the balance the Emperors maintained, the ones who had hated the Emperors but hated the alternative more. The question was spreading, and questions like that, once they start moving through populations, develop a momentum of their own. Marie Ford was running on its evening routine, its rhythms uninterrupted, which was itself a form of message. The message that this was an institution of sufficient size and stability that even a day like today was absorbed without disruption to the basic structure of things. Mess call at 1800. Watch rotation at 2000. Report filing at 2200. The young Marine guard from the plaza. Her name was Lieutenant Hannah Cease, though the story hadn't asked her name yet, because names require a moment of stillness to land and the day had not had those. Sat in the mess hall with a tray she'd filled on autopilot and hadn't touched, and thought about the morning. She'd been assigned to the scaffold because of her record. Dependable. Composed. Good in high-stress situations. Her commanding officer had picked her specifically because the Emperor executions required personnel who would not, under any circumstances, do anything that would read poorly in the history books. She'd done her job. She'd stood at her post, and she'd maintained protocol, and she hadn't flinched, not even at the end, which was more than could be said for 2 of her fellow guards who had been replaced in the rotation after the first positioning check because they'd gone pale at the wrong moment. She'd been fine. She pushed the food around her tray. Nobody can execute a want. The mess hall around her was the ordinary noise of 200 people eating at the end of a significant day. A noise with a particular texture that was partly professional deflation, the specific relief of a large operation completed, and partly something else, something quieter, that she noticed because she was looking for it. Small conversations that stopped when she walked by. People eating fast and leaving. A table near the window where 4 officers were talking very quietly, hunched forward, the body language of people saying things they weren't sure were safe to say. She didn't know what that meant yet. But she filed it. Her commanding officer appeared at her elbow. Captain Trees, a compact, efficient man who ran his unit with the kind of genuine care for his people that existed underneath his institutional strictness, and which his people were all aware of and none of them mentioned. "Good work today, Lieutenant," he said. "Thank you, sir." He looked at her tray. "Eat something." "Yes, sir." He started to leave. stopped, came back. The prisoner, he said quietly, not looking directly at her. The one in the last chair. Did he say something to you? She kept her expression perfectly neutral, which was a skill she'd spent 3 years developing and which served her now. He spoke. Per protocol, I maintain non-engagement. Trees nodded slowly. Right. He looked at her tray again. Eat something, Lieutenant. And he left. She looked at the food for another 30 seconds. Then she ate. Because she was a good Marine and good Marines maintained their physical capability even on hard days, and because the thing in her chest, the thing that had the general shape of a question she hadn't been asked yet, was going to need energy if it was going to go anywhere. She didn't know where it was going, but she was starting to suspect it was going somewhere. 3 hours north of Briar, on an unnamed patch of ocean between two weather systems that provided natural radar interference, Fleet Admiral Sakazuki's personal intelligence vessel, unmarked, running without lights, was holding position while a meeting happened in its interior that appeared on no official record. The men in the room were not all Marines. 3 of them were, and senior ones at that. The others were representatives of interests that the world government officially acknowledged in some contexts and officially denied in others, which was a category of relationship that the celestial dragons had been comfortable maintaining for as long as anyone in the room had been alive. Sakazuki sat at the head of the table. He had changed out of his uniform into the kind of plain dark clothes that powerful men wear when they want the meeting to be about what's being said rather than who's saying it, though in his case the identity was sufficiently present without the uniform that it was a mostly symbolic gesture. The Straw Hat Crew, said the man on his left. A heavy-set man, gray-bearded, with the specific combination of wealth and nervousness that characterized people who had built significant fortunes by knowing which side to be on, and were currently doing rapid calculations about whether the side they were on was still the right one. What about them? Sakazuki said. They're not scattering. My ships near Briar are reporting that the Thousand Sunny is in the harbor and undergoing repairs. Active repairs. They're not retreating. The man's thick fingers moved on the table. The navigator and the archaeologist specifically, there are concerns about what they know and what they might. The archaeologist is a concern, Sakazuki said. She's been a concern for years. The bounty elevation I submitted last week addresses that. A bounty elevation means someone has to collect it. The Straw Hats have a tendency to. I'm aware of their tendency. Sakazuki's voice had not changed in tone or volume. It was the equivalent of a very heavy door closing gently but completely. The crew will be addressed. They are on the timeline. They are not the immediate priority. And if they reach someone with a fleet? If they organize the remaining, then we address that when it happens. He looked at the man steadily. I built this operation over 6 years. I ran the intelligence myself. I positioned the admirals. I chose the day, the time, and the method. I am not going to start improvising because 8 pirates on a damaged ship are making choices that fall within the range of expected responses. He let that sit for a second. The timeline holds. Secondary operations begin in 72 hours. The heavy-set man nodded quickly and stopped talking. One of the Marine representatives, a rear admiral, young for his rank, with the sharp eyes of someone who had gotten where he was through ability rather than connection and was in this room because Sakazuki wanted people around him who were in that category, said quietly, There's something else. Sakazuki looked at him. Fujitora. He filed a formal objection this afternoon. To the secondary operations protocol. In writing. The room had a particular stillness for a moment. I know, Sakazuki said. It's on record. If the secondary operations move forward and Fujitora's objection is on record, Isho files objections. Sakazuki said. He files them, and then he does his duty. That is how Fujitora works. It has always been how Fujitora works. Something moved behind his eyes very briefly. He believes in the institution, even when he disagrees with me. That is why he is an admiral, and not a problem. Another silence. And if he stops believing in the institution? The rear admiral said. Sakazuki looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that the rear admiral, who was not a cowardly man, had to work at holding eye contact. Then he becomes a problem, Sakazuki said. That I address on the timeline. He stood. The meeting was over. He moved toward the door without hurry, without drama, with the particular quality of motion that he always had, like gravity itself had slightly adjusted its alignment to accommodate him. At the door he stopped, not turning around. 72 hours, he said. Be ready. He left. Behind him, the men in the room exhaled by varying degrees, like a small tide going out, and began the careful work of arranging their faces and their intentions for what was coming next. That night, on the Thousand Sunny, Frankie finished the last of the repairs just past midnight. He sat back on the hull, looked at what he'd done, and said "super" to himself quietly, without the usual volume, because quiet was what the night wanted and even Frankie could read the night. The crew had eaten Sanji's food, which had been extraordinary in the way that Sanji's food was always extraordinary, but more so tonight, as if he'd put something extra into it that didn't have a culinary name. They'd talked some, and been quiet some, and the talking and the quiet had been roughly in the right proportions. Brooke had played his violin eventually, one piece, something long and slow and shaped like longing, and nobody asked him to stop. Zoro was on watch. He stood at the bow in the dark with the stars doing their work above him and the harbor around him and 3 swords at his side, which was the configuration that made him feel most like himself, and he watched the water and the cliff edges and the single light in the village that never seemed to go out regardless of the hour. He thought about the sea the way Luffy had always talked about it, not as an obstacle or a medium but as the thing itself, the actual destination, the whole point. He'd never quite gotten that the way Luffy had. He used the sea. He respected it. He understood its physics and its moods in the practical way of someone who'd spent years on it. But standing here tonight, with the stars that clear and the water that dark and the world as large and broken as it currently was, he felt something that might have been what Luffy meant. The sea was still here. It didn't know about the executions. It didn't care about the world government's timelines or the power vacuum or the secondary operations. It just moved in the dark, doing what it did, and it would be doing it after every human agenda had worked itself out one way or another. That was either meaningless or the most important thing, and Zoro suspected it was both, which was the kind of thought that Luffy would have expressed somehow by laughing and that Zoro could only express by standing still with it. He stood still with it. The coordinates for Trist were already in the navigator's chart. 3 days south. Law was waiting there with information they needed and plans he was probably already too far into to reverse. The world had broken open today. Something old and enormous had shifted and the shape of everything was different now. Zoro had grown up in a dojo and had learned, from a woman who could split boulders with her feet and who never explained herself when she could demonstrate instead, that the correct response to something breaking was not to try to restore it to the original shape. The original shape was over. The correct response was to understand the new shape, find its weak points, and know where to put your hands. He knew where to put his hands. He looked at the dark water for another hour, because it was his watch and because the stars were good company when you needed the kind that didn't talk. Then the sky began to lighten, very slowly, at the eastern edge, and a new day started building itself out of the dark, and Zoro watched it come the way a man watches something he intends to meet head-on, without stepping back, without looking away. The sea moved beneath the hull of the Sunny. The stars faded. The world kept being what it now was. And somewhere south of them, on an island that didn't appear on most charts, a man with a spotted hat and a room-temperature personality and very good information sat in a dark harbor and waited, because he was the kind of person who understood that the ones who arrived prepared were the ones who had any business arriving at all. The dawn came in cold and clear and completely indifferent, the way dawns always do, and 3 swords caught the first of its light on their sheaths, and their owner's jaw was set, and his eyes were forward, and the question that the world had been asking since yesterday morning, "What do we do?" had, in this particular man's case, already been answered, silently and completely, sometime in the night when he wasn't looking at it directly. We go. We fix it. We make it worth what it cost. Simple. So obvious it was almost embarrassing. He would have rolled his eyes at himself for thinking something so straightforward, except that it was true, and true things deserved a little dignity even when they were inconveniently basic. He turned from the bow and went to wake the crew. It was time to move. Chapter 3. The burning shore of the island of Trist looked exactly like what it was, a place that didn't want to be found. Low hills covered in gray-green scrub, a coastline that was mostly rock and barely enough harbor to call itself one, the kind of place that cartographers marked with a dash and moved on from. The eastern approach was shallow enough that Frankie had to manually pilot the Sunny through by depth gauge while Nami stood at the bow reading the water's color for hidden reef, which she did with the quiet, focused competence of someone who had been reading water since before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. They came into the northern harbor just past noon on the third day, and the polar tang was already there. It sat low in the water the way submarines did when they were surfaced and vaguely annoyed about it, its yellow hull dulled by recent travel, a single crew member visible on the conning tower who spotted the Sunny coming in and disappeared below deck without gesture or hail. "Warm welcome," Sanji said, from behind Zoro's left shoulder, cigarette angled at the sky. "It's Law," Zoro said. "That is the warm welcome." They anchored 20 meters off and took the small boat in. Zoro, Nami, Robin, and Sanji, because when Zoro had told the rest of the crew the parameters Law had specified, fewer people, fewer complications, Usopp had immediately and loudly volunteered not to come, and Chopper had agreed with such obvious relief that it had almost been funny. And Brooke had simply nodded with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had seen enough world to know which situations called for his particular skills and which ones called for a quieter hand. Frankie stayed with the ship. He'd also made very clear, in the specific register he used when something was non-negotiable, that he would have the Sunny ready to move within 60 seconds of notice, at any hour, under any weather condition, and if anyone tried to board her uninvited they would discover what Frankie radical beam meant at close range. Law was waiting for them on the dock. He looked like he hadn't slept more than the barest functional minimum since the executions, which on Law manifested not as visible exhaustion but as a particular sharpness, like he'd been stripped of everything non-essential, and what remained was pure mechanism. He had his hat on, his coat, his sword. He looked at the four of them coming up the dock and his expression did the thing it always did, assessed, categorized, moved on. "You brought the cook," he said. "Problem?" Sanji said. "No. I was going to say I have almost nothing edible on the Tang right now and that's probably about to be addressed." Sanji looked at him for a second, processing the fact that this was Law's version of a request. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Law turned and walked. They followed. The polar tang's interior was cramped in the way of all submarines, everything folded into the available space with engineering precision, nothing wasted, the aesthetic of a place that had been designed by someone who thought comfort was a secondary consideration to function and had never fully changed their mind. Law had a room that served as both his medical bay and his war room, which said something about him that was probably accurate. He had a map on the main table. Not a navigation chart, a political map, annotated in his own hand, with small marks in red and black at what looked like 30 or 40 locations across every ocean. Nami looked at it, and said nothing for a moment, just read it, and the reading changed her expression incrementally in a way that was worse than if she'd reacted immediately. "Talk," Zoro said. Law sat on the edge of the table. "The Secondary Operations Protocol. You've heard the term. Robin mentioned it," Nami said. "It's real, it's active, and the 72-hour window opened approximately." He checked his watch. 19 hours ago. He pointed at the red marks. "These are confirmed Marine Fleet movements in the last 48 hours. Not patrol movements. Positioning movements. They're staging here, here, and here. 3 points spread across the New World. Which puts them within strike range of Wano's coastline, Tato Land's outer islands, and the northern approach to Elbaf." Robin looked at the marks. "They're not waiting for the vacuum to stabilize. They're moving to claim the territories before anything else can fill the space. Correct. The emperors weren't just powerful individuals. They were territorial controls. Entire island populations existed under their protection, or under something close enough to protection that it functioned the same way. With the emperors gone, those islands are, in the world governance framework, ungoverned. And ungoverned territories require governance. Their governance, Nami said. Their governance. Which means cipher pole presence, marine garrison, taxation restructuring, selective population relocation, Sanji said. He'd stopped moving around the small galley attached to the room and was looking at Law directly. It's in the secondary operations documents. I have a partial copy. Cost me 3 crew members and 4 months of intelligence work to get, but it exists. Law reached into his coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers, worn at the creases. He spread it on the table beside the map. They're calling it civil reintegration. It means the removal of populations that are determined to be, and I'm reading directly here, culturally incompatible with world government civil order. The room was quiet. How many islands? Nami asked. 14 in the first phase. More in subsequent phases if the first succeeds without significant resistance. Zoro looked at the map. His eyes moved across the red marks without hurry, reading the geometry of it. The weight positions made patterns. When does the first phase hit? Wano. 53 hours from now, based on the fleet positioning. Law folded his hands. There's no emperor there anymore. No Kaido. The alliance that formed to take Kaido down, Momonosuke's government, is young and hasn't had time to build the kind of military deterrent that would make the world government reconsider the economics of the operation. He looked at Zoro. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Ask. Can you stop an admiral? In a direct engagement? The question landed in the room and sat there. Sanji looked at Zoro. Robin looked at Zoro. Nami looked at the map and then at Zoro. Zoro looked at the map for another second. Then he looked at Law. Which one? Ryakujia. Green Bull. He's leading the Wano operation. Law's jaw tightened slightly. He's going to make a case study of it. If Wano falls cleanly and quickly, every other island on this list becomes easier. The message it sends, I know what the message is. Zoro straightened. Yes. I can stop him. Law studied him for a long moment. You've fought him before. No. You've fought admirals before. One. A pause. Enough of one. Law seemed to accept this, not because he fully believed in the certainty of it, but because he understood that certain kinds of confidence were not bravado but genuine self-knowledge, and that Zoro was constitutionally incapable of the other kind. Then Wano is the first move, Nami said. She was already pulling her own charts out, spreading them alongside Law's political map, the two documents fitting together like overlapping weather systems. 53 hours. We can make it in 40 if we push the Sunny. She looked at Law. The Tang? The Tang comes. My crew has people who know Wano's waters from the outside. He paused. And I have a message from Sabo. That got everyone's attention differently. Zoro with a slight stilling, Sanji with the quick look of someone recalibrating, Robin with the contained attention she gave everything significant. He's moving phase 1, Law said. Revolutionary Army cells across 6 oceans are activated. It's not combat ready yet, it's pressure, disruption, a signal to the world that the opposition exists and is organized. But he wants coordination. He doesn't want the Revolutionary Army doing one thing while the Straw Hats do something adjacent that undermines it. What does he want us to do specifically? Nami asked. Be visible. He wants the Straw Hat flag in the sky over Wano when the Marines arrive. He wants the world to see it. Law's voice was flat, informational, carrying the faintest undertone of someone who found the symbolism of the plan both tactically sound and slightly more romantic than his personal preference. He said, and I'm quoting, Luffy's crew showing up is worth 3 fleets in terms of what it tells every pirate and every oppressed population on every ocean. Silence. He's right, Robin said quietly. Probably, Law said. I hate that he's right, but probably. Zoro was already standing up. Then we go to Wano. Nami, how fast can you have a route plotted? I already have a route plotted, she said, without looking up from her chart. I plotted it while Law was talking. We leave in 2 hours. That gives Sanji time to actually sort the Tang's food situation and gives Frankie time to run a check on the secondary sale. Law looked at her. You plotted a route during the briefing. I multitask. She rolled her chart with practiced efficiency. Also, I've been worried about Wano since before you said the word Wano, so I had a rough outline in my head for the past day. The briefing just confirmed the specifics. She looked at Law evenly. Is there anything else? Law blinked, which was the closest his face got to being caught off guard. No. That's everything. Good. Then someone tell Frankie we're leaving in 2 hours and someone make sure Chopper's medical kit is fully stocked, because if we're going up against an admiral we're going to need it. She picked up her instruments and moved toward the door with the velocity of a woman who had transformed grief into forward motion and was now entirely committed to the speed of it. They made it to Wano's outer waters in 38 hours, which was 2 hours ahead of Nami's already aggressive projection, because the wind had come up favorable and stayed that way with the specific stubborn generosity that the sea offered sometimes, as if it too had opinions about certain journeys and wanted particular ones to succeed. The Marine fleet was already there. Not just staging, they had moved early, by almost 8 hours, which meant someone in the intelligence chain had fed them updated information about the Straw Hats movement, and the someone was almost certainly one of the contacts in Law's network that had been turned. Law said this without visible anger when they spotted the fleet on the horizon, in the measured tone of a man noting a variable that had changed and updating his model accordingly, though Zoro noticed his hand went to Kikoka's hill briefly before releasing. 11 ships. A large marine presence for what was being framed as a civil reintegration operation, but then again, Wano had a complicated history and the world government had presumably done their reading. And at the center of the formation, standing at the prow of the flagship with the specific quality of stillness that very powerful people carry, the stillness of things that have no need to advertise themselves, was Admiral Ryakuji. He was tall. He was wearing a dark marine coat, not hanging off the shoulders in the traditional admiral fashion but actually on, sleeves buttoned, like a man who had dressed for functionality rather than theater. He had dark hair pulled back severely and no visible weapons, because his devil fruit was his weapon, and it was sufficient. From the distance, through the scope Nami handed wordlessly to Zoro, he looked at the approaching Thousand Sunny and the polar Tang with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had decided it was, on balance, marginally interesting. He knew we were coming, Usopp said from where he'd appeared on the deck despite the fact that this was not, technically, supposed to be his part of the operation. Yes, Zoro said. So he has a plan? Yes. Do we have a plan? Zoro handed the scope back to Nami. We have something better. What's better than a plan? Zoro stepped forward to the bow. The fact that we don't need one. The Marine fleet's response to the Thousand Sunny's approach was professionally executed. 3 ships moved to intercept, formations tightened, the 2 flanking vessels adjusted position to cut off retreat routes that the fleet's commander had clearly identified as the most likely escape vectors. Good tactics. The kind of tactics that worked against crews that thought about escape. The Sunny didn't slow down. It came through the formation at full sail, Frankie at the helm with the kind of mechanical joy he reserved for situations that required absolute physical confidence, and when the first intercepting ship moved to cut them off, the Sunny went over it, barely, the modified pontoons catching the enemy vessels railing as they passed, and kept going, straight toward the flagship. On the Tang, Law had submerged and was moving through the water beneath the fleet's attention, which was its own kind of plan and a considerably more patient one than Zoro's. Ryakuji watched the Sunny come through his fleet's formation, and something crossed his face that might have been amusement in a man with different architecture. He raised one hand, and from his fingers, wood-green tendrils of growth began curling outward, slowly, with the organic patience of something that knew it had time. "Straw Hat's crew," he said, loudly enough to carry across the water without effort. His voice was the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it. "You've come to defend Wano. I respect the impulse. I want you to understand that what happens here today is going to happen regardless. The only variable is whether you make it complicated." The Sunny pulled up 60 meters off the flagship. The deck was visible from both ships. Zoro was standing at the prow. He had all three swords out, which was notable because he typically reserved that configuration for things he took seriously. The morning light caught the blades at different angles: Wado Ikemanji's white gleam, Sandai Kitetsu's restless shimmer, Enma's darker, hungrier quality that made it look like it was absorbing light rather than reflecting it. "You're the one who makes this complicated," Zoro said across the water. "Conversational. No performance in it." Ryakuji looked at him. Actually looked. The assessment was visible, a genuine evaluation rather than a dismissal. "Roranoa Zoro. You're the one they say cut through my hawk. I'm working on it. You've fought admirals before. 1.5, depending on how you count." The corner of Ryakuji's mouth did something. "And you think that qualifies you too? I think it qualifies me to be standing here without being afraid of you," Zoro said. "Which I'm not. So let's stop talking." He jumped. The distance between the Sunny and the flagship was 60 meters of open water, which was a distance that should have ended the conversation immediately and decisively. Zoro crossed it the way he crossed most obstacles, by treating them as information about the problem rather than the problem itself. He hit the flagship's railing, bounced off the rigging, and landed on the deck 12 feet from Ryakuji in the time it took most people to register he'd moved. Ryakuji moved faster than something rooted in the deck had any right to. The tendrils came from every direction simultaneously, not vines but something denser, hardwood growth, dense and accelerating, the kind of growth that had the mass of old trees compressed into seconds of emergence. They came at Zoro from 6 angles, and he cut 4 of them before the other 2 reached him, and the 2 that reached him discovered what it meant to grab something covered in active hockey. The cut ends of the tendrils fell to the deck. They were already regrowing. "Faster than I expected," Ryakuji said. He hadn't moved from where he was standing, which meant he was fighting at range, which meant the range was the weapon. The tendrils came again, and this time there were more of them, and they weren't coming from his hands anymore. They were coming from the deck itself, from the railing, from the mast, from every surface of wood on the ship that he could apparently access through contact. Zoro moved through them. Not around, through, cutting the ones that mattered and letting the ones that didn't matter grab things that weren't vital, which was a specific kind of calculation that required knowing exactly where your body was in 3 dimensions at all times and what was important about each part of it. He moved toward Ryakuji through the continuous growth, 3 blades working in the flowing 3-sword pattern that looked chaotic to opponents who had never faced it, and revealed itself to be precisely structured only when it was already too late. He got within 10 feet and Ryakuji finally moved, sideways and fast, the tendrils adjusting with him, and for 20 seconds it was the kind of fight that stopped the Marines on the surrounding ships from doing anything other than watching, because whatever side you were on, you recognized when you were seeing something that didn't happen often. Then Zoro used Enma. He hadn't used it at full draw yet. He'd been feeling the Admiral out, reading the growth patterns, learning the physics of the fruit. He knew enough now. He pulled the hockey through Enma the way you open a valve that's been held shut, letting it draw what it wanted, and the blade went dark, not black, darker than black, the color of a cut through something fundamental, and he brought it across in a diagonal arc that wasn't aimed at Ryakuji's body. It was aimed at the flagship. The cut went from the port railing to the starboard waterline in one movement, and it went through everything in between, and the ship made a sound like a mountain deciding to become 2 mountains, and then it started to come apart in the way that things that have been decisively cut come apart, with a kind of structural honesty, all at once, the pretense of integrity abandoned. Ryakuji looked at his ship for half a second. Then at Zoro. The amusement was gone from whatever had been there. "You cut my ship," he said. "You can regrow it," Zoro said. He wasn't breathing hard. He probably should have been breathing harder. I can do the next one too. Ryakuji was quiet for a second. The ship was going into the water around them, which was creating a logistical issue for the marine crews on the surrounding vessels who were receiving contradictory instructions from various levels of command about whether to engage the Straw Hats or assist the flagship or both, simultaneously, which was not an operationally coherent set of orders. You'll sink 11 ships to stop this operation? Ryakuji said. If that's what it takes. Zoro looked at him directly. I'll tell you what I won't do. I won't let you take Wano. Not today, not this way. You want to change that, come at me with everything you have and we'll find out if you can. Below the surface of the harbor, the polar tang had positioned itself precisely under the 3 nearest marine vessels, and Law's voice came through a waterproof den mushy that someone on the Sunny relayed to the deck. I have 3 ships in range of shambles. Say the word. Ryakuji heard it. His jaw tightened. You've prepared this, he said. We prepared, Zoro said. Because some things are worth preparing for. The Marines on the surrounding ships were waiting. Ryakuji stood on the sinking deck of his flagship in the water that was coming up around his ankles. It was moving remarkably quickly, the cut having been rather thorough, and looked at Roronoa Zoro, and the calculation happened visibly behind his eyes, the weighing of what was worth what. 11 ships. Against one man with 3 swords who had just bisected a warship without appearing to exert himself fully, plus a submarine captain who had positional advantage over a third of the fleet, plus the 1,000 Sunny with whatever its crew could bring to bear, all of this in Wano's waters where the terrain favored defenders and the local population was emphatically not going to be cooperative. The operation was supposed to be clean and demonstrate the world government's authority through unresisted execution. It was not currently clean. And Ryakuji, whatever his politics, was not the kind of man who mistook stubbornness for strength. Fall back, he said to the fleet. Hold formation. We are assessing the situation. On the Sunny's deck, Nami let out a breath through her nose that was entirely controlled and revealed nothing of what it cost her to hold it while Zoro was on that sinking deck being casual about dying. Usopp made a small sound beside her that was technically inaudible. He's fine, she said. I know, Usopp said, at a volume that suggested he was still working on believing it. Zoro stepped off the sinking flagship's railing onto a piece of debris that got him to the water's surface, then onto another piece, moving back toward the Sunny with the unhurried quality of someone walking home after an errand. He pulled himself up onto the Sunny's deck. 3 swords in hand. Water on his boots. He looked at the assembled crew looking at him. What? He said. Nothing, Nami said precisely. You literally cut an admiral's ship in half, Usopp said. He was using it. Zoro sheathed Wado Ikemanji, then Kitetsu, then Enma, in the particular order he always used, the familiarity of the sequence something close to punctuation. The ship was part of the fight. Right, yeah, obviously, of course. Usopp sat down slightly. From across the water, Ryakuji's voice carried, still the voice of a man who had not lost and had not won but had made a calculation. This isn't finished, Roronoa. I know, Zoro said without turning around. When it is finished, you'll know. The Marines held position for 6 hours. Then they withdrew north. Not a full retreat, a repositioning, the official Marine language for a tactical decision that needed to appear like something other than backing down. They would return. Everyone on both sides understood this. The withdrawal was not a resolution, it was a postponement, and the terms of the postponement would be determined by what happened next in the larger picture. But for now, Wano's coastline was clear. The news hit Wano before the Sunny even docked. Someone on the cliff roads above the harbor had been watching with a scope, and the story traveled inward through the country in the way that certain kinds of stories always travel, fast, growing slightly in the telling, arriving at its destination larger and warmer than it left. By the time the Sunny entered the harbor, there were people at the docks. Not a crowd. Not a welcome party organized by anyone. Just people who had heard that the Straw Hat crew had come to the outer waters and told the Marine fleet to leave, and who had felt something at that news that needed to be in proximity to the thing that caused it. Momonosuke was at the dock. He'd grown, in the time since the crew had last been here, not just physically, though that too, but in the way that young people grow when they're given responsibility that's slightly too large and rise to it rather than folding. He stood with the posture of someone who had been practicing posture because he understood that posture was a form of communication, and his eyes had the redness of someone who had been doing their crying in private. "I heard," he said to Zoro, who had come down the gangplank first. I heard." "Yeah," Zoro said. Momonosuke looked at him, at the crew coming off the ship behind him, at the flag on the Sunny's mast, the Straw Hat Jolly Roger, sun-faded and salt-stiffened and there, present, flying over Wano's harbor. Something moved in his face. He would have come himself. Luffy would have come himself. He would have been here before us, Zoro said. "Already eating your food." A short silence. Then Momonosuke made a sound that was either a laugh or its antecedent, something in the neighborhood of laughter, and he pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a second. He straightened. "You stopped the fleet. Temporarily. That's more than we could have done alone." "You won't be alone," Zoro said. He wasn't speaking loudly, but it carried, the way things carry when they're said without performance. The people at the dock heard it. "Not while this crew is sailing." That evening, in the great hall of the Flower Capital, they had something that was not quite a celebration and not quite a planning session but lived in the specific space between those things, food, and talk, and the necessary business of figuring out the next step of things while also acknowledging, however briefly, that the current step had been worth something. Law was at the table, working through documents and talking with two of Momonosuke's intelligence advisors in the low, rapid cadence he used when information was moving faster than he liked. Nami had her charts out again, updated now with the Marine fleet's repositioning, the new lines of the tactical picture shifting under her pencil in real time. Robin sat with Momonosuke's head scholar, and they talked quietly for a long time about the poneglyphs in Wano, about what was recorded in them, and what wasn't, and toward the end of the conversation Robin said something that made the scholar stop completely and look at her with the expression of someone recalibrating something fundamental. Sanji had taken over the kitchen within 15 minutes of arrival, having engaged the existing cooks in a collaboration of such enthusiastic efficiency that they'd been simultaneously inspired and mildly exhausted, and the food that came out was the kind of food that made people feel, in some way they couldn't precisely articulate, that things were going to be workable. Chopper was in a corner of the hall doing what Chopper always did when he had access to local healers, trading medical knowledge back and forth with the focused delight of someone who found other people's expertise consistently surprising and wonderful. He'd already identified 3 local plant compounds that he hadn't encountered before and was describing their potential applications with the intensity of a man who had fully forgotten that there had been a war that morning. Brooke sat beside Zoro and they didn't talk, which was fine, because sometimes the right company was the kind that didn't require talking. Brooke played a few notes on a small instrument he'd borrowed from a musician in the hall, testing its range, finding what it could do. The notes were quiet and exploratory, not performing but thinking through sound, and Zoro listened to them the way he listened to the ocean, with half his attention, using it as a kind of background structure for the thinking he was doing in the foreground. Usopp was telling the story of the morning's engagement to a group of Wano soldiers who had gathered to listen, and the story was already better than the event, not dishonest, just more vivid, the parts that had been genuinely extraordinary given enough space to actually read as extraordinary. And then, Usopp was saying, his voice dropping for effect, his hands moving through the gestures of a skilled storyteller. And then he just looks at the Admiral's flagship. This massive warship. And he draws Enma, and there's this moment where even the sea seems to go quiet, and he cuts it clean through. One stroke. The whole ship. He paused for maximum effect, reading his audience. The Admiral looked at what was left of his ship going into the water, and then he looked at Zoro, and I'm telling you, I'm telling you, there was something in that man's eyes that I have only seen a handful of times in my life, which is a life that has contained a remarkable number of extraordinary moments. Was it fear? One of the soldiers asked. Usopp considered this with the gravity it deserved. It was respect, he said, which, in an admiral, is worth more. Zoro, across the room, heard none of this. But the soldier next to Usopp glanced at the swordsman and nodded slowly, the way you nod at a thing you've decided to believe in, and that was something. Ryakuju stood on the deck of the rearmost ship in the repositioned fleet, watching Wano's distant coastline, and he composed his report to Fleet Admiral Sakazuki with the careful language of a man who was being honest and also aware that honesty required framing. He described the engagement accurately. The Straw Hat crew's arrival, their preparation, the cut to the flagship, the positional threat from Trafalgar Law's submarine, the calculation he made about the cost of forcing the operation through in those conditions. He described Zoro's capability accurately. He'd fought enough high-level opponents to recognize what he'd seen without ego interfering with the assessment. The man was genuinely exceptional. The sword, the Dark One Enma, was operating at a level that required specific tactical consideration. He ended the report with a recommendation. The Wano operation should be reattempted with additional admiral support, or delayed until the Straw Hat crew was neutralized through other means. He sent it. He went below. He stood in his quarters and thought about the cut, not with resentment, but with the focused analytical attention he gave things that taught him something. He'd been surprised. He didn't enjoy being surprised. It would not happen again. Akainu's response arrived in 40 minutes. Understood. Hold position. Secondary adjustment incoming. Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. Ryakuji read it twice. Secondary adjustment. He didn't know what that meant in specific terms, but the brevity of it, Sakazuki's responses scaled in length to how much reassurance he felt the recipient needed, and brevity meant that he was operating from surplus rather than deficit, suggested that whatever it was already in motion. Something about that made Ryakuji, who was not given to discomfort, feel something adjacent to it. He didn't know what the secondary adjustment was. He didn't know what Sakazuki was willing to do to ensure the timeline held. He had, in the course of his career, seen what Sakazuki was willing to do when he felt the timeline required it. He put the report down and went back to deck to watch the coastline, and the specific thing he was feeling, examined honestly, was something between professional concern and a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. At what point did righteous absolute certainty become the most dangerous thing in any room? He didn't know. He was an admiral. He followed orders and trusted the institution and fought for justice as the institution defined it. He watched the lights of Wano beginning to come on as evening fell, and he thought about the question, and he didn't have an answer, and the not having was a small, persistent discomfort that he would carry with him into whatever came next. In the great hall of the flower capital, as the evening deepened and the food was cleared and the conversation grew quieter and more specific, Robin excused herself and walked out to the garden. She stood in the garden for a while, looking at nothing in particular, the shapes of the sculpted trees, the geometry of the stone path, the edge of the sky above the walls where the stars were coming out one by one. Then she took from her coat a folded piece of paper. She'd been carrying it for 3 days. She'd copied it from a document in the Polar Tang's intelligence files while Law was briefing the others, quickly and precisely, because her hands were fast and her memory was perfect, and the document had contained something that nobody else had noticed because they weren't looking for it. A name. In the margin of the secondary operations protocol, in handwriting different from the main document, was a name she'd encountered once before, in a fragment of poneglyph text that had never been fully translated, from a location so remote that she doubted the fragment's authenticity for years. The name was not a person's name. It was the name of a place. A location that the Void Century text had described in terms that she'd always read as mythological rather than geographic, because the alternative, that it was real, and navigable, and contained what the text said it contained, was the kind of thing that changed everything. She folded the paper again. She looked at the stars. She went back inside. She sat down next to Nami and waited for the right moment in the conversation, and when it came she said quietly, "I need to tell you something. About Laugh Tale." She paused. "And about what's actually there." Nami looked at her. The navigator's eyes, in the lamplight, were the eyes of someone who was prepared, functionally and temperamentally, for exactly this kind of information, not eager for it, exactly, but ready in the way that well-made things are ready. "Okay," Nami said. "We need to go there," Robin said. "Not eventually. Soon. Before the world government understands what I think I've found." Nami looked at the map open between them. At the long, complicated, dangerous route to the end of the Grand Line. At the numbers of marine ships between here and there. At the shape of the thing she was being asked to navigate. She pulled the map closer. She picked up her pencil. She started to plan. Because this was what she did. This was what she had always done. When everything was uncertain and dangerous and larger than reasonable, Nami made the map. She found the route through. She decided where to put the ship. The pencil moved. The route took shape. In the garden outside, the stars continued their work. The sea moved against Wano's coastline, indifferent and constant and enormous, carrying its currents in directions that the surface gave no sign of. Something was coming. Several things were coming, from several directions at once. The crew ate and talked and planned and rested, and the straw hat flag moved on the Sunny's mast in the harbor wind, visible from the cliff roads above, visible from the sea below, visible, as Sabo had intended, to anyone in the world who knew what it meant. It meant, we're still here. It meant, this isn't over. It meant, in the particular language of a crew who had learned what they knew from a man who laughed at the sky, nothing worth doing is done easily, and nothing worth having was ever given freely, and the sea is wide and we intend to cross all of it. The flag moved. The stars turned. The pencil drew the route. Chapter 4, The Will of D. Robin told them at dawn. Not in the great hall, not at the planning table with maps spread and cigarettes burning and everyone in their operational mode. She waited until the hour when Wano was its quietest, when the night watch had gone in and the morning watch hadn't fully woken up, when the only light was the particular blue-gray of early sky and the harbor water was perfectly still. She gathered them on the Sunny's deck, all of them, Zoro and Nami and Sanji and Usopp and Chopper and Brook and Frankie, and she sat in her chair that had somehow migrated back to the deck again, and she put the folded paper on the table in front of her and told them what she knew. She told them plainly. No preamble, no qualification. Robin had learned, across years of carrying enormous things alone, that the moment you decided to share something was the moment to actually share it, not to circle it. "The Rio Poneglyph," she said. "The one that records the true history of the Void Century. I've read it. Most of what's in it I've known for some time." She looked at her hands. "But there's a section in the margin of the original stone, not carved, scratched, with something improvised, done quickly, probably in the last hours before the ancient kingdom fell. I almost missed it the first time because the script shifts to an older dialect that even Joy Boy's era would have considered archaic." She paused. "It's a set of coordinates. And a sentence." The crew waited. The harbor water was still. The sentence is, what could not be said in the world that was, let it speak in the world that must become. She looked up. And the coordinates point to a specific location inside Laugh Tale. Not the island itself, a location within it. A room, or a structure, based on the directional encoding. "What's in the room?" Nami asked. "The message." Robin picked up the paper, looked at it, set it down. The Void Century wasn't just an era that got erased. It was an era that got hidden, deliberately, specifically, with the expectation that someone would eventually need to find it. The ancient kingdom knew it was losing. They knew the world government's founding alliance was going to win, and would write the history afterward. So they hid the actual history. Not in the poneglyphs, or not only in the poneglyphs. In something at Laugh Tale that I believe is a complete record. Documentary, not encoded. Written to be read and broadcast. Written to be made public. Silence. Broadcast how? Frankie asked. There's a reference in the poneglyph margin to something the ancient texts call the voice of all things, not the instinct, not the ability to hear poneglyphs. A physical structure. A transmission tower built into the geography of Laugh-Tale itself, using technology that the ancient kingdom developed and that the world government has been suppressing the knowledge of for 800 years. She looked at Frankie. I believe it's still functional. The materials described in the text are essentially indestructible given what we know about ancient construction methods. Frankie stared at her. Then he took off his sunglasses. He only did that when something was serious enough to require his unmediated face. You're telling me there's an 800-year-old broadcast tower at the end of the Grand Line? I'm telling you I believe there is, yes. And if it's functional, then the truth of the void century goes to every den mushy receiver on every ocean simultaneously. Every ship, every island, every marine base, every person with a receiver in range. Robin's voice was even. The world government has maintained its power for 800 years partly through force and partly through controlling the story. What the celestial dragons are, where they actually come from, what they did to get there. If the world knows that, the nature of the conflict changes fundamentally. It stops being pirates against the government. It becomes something else. What does it become? Brooke asked quietly. Robin looked at him. The world deciding what it actually wants to be. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. The sky was lightening, the blue-gray becoming something warmer, the first suggestions of yellow at the horizon. Usopp broke the silence, which was appropriate because Usopp often broke silences with the thing everyone else was thinking but hadn't said yet. So we need to get to Laugh-Tale. Yes. Which is at the end of the Grand Line. Yes. Which is extremely far, and the route goes through what I imagine is now a significant amount of hostile marine activity. Yes. Robin picked up the paper and folded it again, precise and careful. But we have an advantage. The world government doesn't know what's at Laugh-Tale. They know the coordinates are significant, Roger got there, and they've spent decades trying to understand what he found. But they don't know about the room. They don't know about the transmission tower. She met each person's eyes in turn. We have a window. It will close when Sakazuki realizes the secondary operations aren't enough to contain what's happening, and starts thinking about what else might be in play. A man like him, he'll eventually look at the poneglyphs and ask the right question. When he does, Laugh-Tale becomes a target. She paused. We should be there first. Zoro had been quiet through all of this, sitting on the rope coil that had become his default location when things required thinking. He'd been watching Robin while she talked, not with the expression of someone following information but with the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was listening to confirm that the decision was correct. How long to get there? He said, looking at Nami. Nami had been doing the calculations since approximately the third sentence Robin had spoken. She knew, because she was Nami, and because her relationship with the mathematics of distance and weather was the most reliable relationship in her life. 11 days. Maybe 9 if we get the right current through the last stretch of the Grand Line. She exhaled slowly. But the route goes through 2 stretches of ocean that are almost certainly under marine surveillance now, and at least one known CP0 operational zone. We'll need to be careful. We'll be fast, Zoro said. Not careful. Fast. Nami looked at him. There's a difference. I know the difference. Fast. She held his look for a second, then nodded, a single, decisive nod that meant she'd already started plotting the fast version of the route in her head. Then we need to leave today. This morning. She looked at the sky. 2 hours. 1, Zoro said. 1.5. Nami said in the tone that meant this was not a negotiating position, but a physical reality about how long things took. Frankie needs to do a systems check and I need to finish plotting the approach to the second surveillance zone. 1.5 hours. Zoro looked at Frankie. Frankie spread his hands in the gesture that meant she's right and I tried to be on your side but she's right. 1.5. Zoro said. Then we move. Law found out they were leaving when he saw the Sunny's sails going up. He appeared on the Tang's conning tower in the state of a man who had been deep in planning and had surfaced to find the world had continued making decisions in his absence, which was a state he found consistently irritating. He crossed to the dock in long strides and looked up at the Sunny's deck where Frankie was doing the systems check with the rapid competence of someone working against a deadline he fully supported. "You're leaving," Law said. "Laugh tail," Nami said from the NAV table visible through the open hatch. "Today." Law stood on the dock and processed this. His jaw moved slightly, which was his equivalent of an expression. "You got information." "Robin did." "Robin." He looked at the ship. "What did she find?" "Ask her." "I'm asking you." Nami appeared at the railing with a chart in one hand and the expression of someone who was managing 17 things simultaneously and was willing to allocate a fraction of her attention to this conversation, but only a fraction. "There's a transmission tower at Laugh-Tail. Ancient construction. Still functional, we think. It can broadcast the Void Century's history to every receiver on every ocean." Law stared at her. "I know," Nami said, and went back to the NAV table. Law stood on the dock for a moment. Then he went back to the Tang and came out 3 minutes later with his hat on and Kikoka on his back and the expression of a man who had made a rapid and complete revision of his priorities. "I'm coming," he said. "I know," Zoro said from the deck. "You were going to tell me." "Eventually." Law's jaw moved again. He turned back to the Tang and said something short and definitive through the conning tower hatch, and Penguin's head appeared briefly to confirm it, and then Law came back to the dock and came up the Sunny's gangplank and settled himself in the corner of the deck that was least in the way of operational activity, which was the specific tactical position of a man who understood when he was a guest. "Your crew knows to follow?" Nami called. "My crew knows," Law said. Sabo's encrypted den mushi went off in Nami's coat pocket before they'd finished raising the second sail. She answered it with one hand while holding the course calculation sheet with the other, which was peak Nami in a crisis. "We're moving," she said before Sabo could speak. A brief pause. "Where?" Laugh tail. Longer pause. "Robin found something." "Robin found something. Tell me." She told him, concisely, the way she gave information when there was no time for elaboration: the transmission tower, the Void Century record, the broadcast potential, the window they had before Sakazuki connected the same dots. She spoke for 90 seconds. Sabo listened without interrupting, which was notable because Sabo did not typically let 90 seconds pass without contributing. When she finished, the den mushi was quiet for long enough that she almost checked if the connection was still active. "That's what he was trying to get to," Sabo said finally. His voice had the quality of something being understood for the first time. "Luffy. The One Piece, the Void Century, finding Laugh Tail. He always said he didn't care about history, but..." A pause. He was going to finish what Roger started. He was going to be the one who found it, and this is what it was. This is what Roger found. "We don't know exactly what Roger found," Nami said carefully. "He laughed," Sabo said. "Roger laughed when he found it. A laugh like Luffy's." A short silence. "Of course he did. Of course that's what was there." Sabo. "I'm fine." He clearly was and wasn't simultaneously, in the specific way of people who have the emotional capacity to hold contradictory states, and the discipline to keep functioning in spite of them. "I'm fine. What do you need from the army?" "Distraction. The Marines are going to notice we're moving through the Grand Line toward Laugh Tail at speed. When they do, we need something else to be happening that's bigger and louder and requires their immediate attention." "How long do you need?" 9 to 11 days. I can give you a week of serious distraction. For 11 days I'd need to do something fairly significant." "Then do something fairly significant," Nami said. "You were going to do it anyway." A sound from Sabo that was brief and genuine, and only marginally sad. "Yeah. I was." A pause. "The Straw Hat Flag." Keep it flying. Always. She closed the connection and went back to the helm, and the sunny sails filled with the morning wind, and they left Wano's harbor with the particular urgency of people moving toward the specific thing that matters most. Fujitora was in his quarters aboard the marine vessel assigned to his observation command when the report landed on his desk, delivered by a runner who had the body language of someone who had not enjoyed carrying this particular document, and was glad to be rid of it. The document was the updated secondary operations roster. New additions flagged in the margin. 3 Revolutionary Army commander locations, identified through recent intelligence, marked for immediate cipher pole intervention. Standard language. Efficient and cold and legal within the world government's own framework, which Fujitora had learned to recognize as the most dangerous kind of thing, the thing that was monstrous in effect and procedurally correct in form. He read it. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again, as if the second reading might change what it said. It didn't. The third entry on the updated roster was not a Revolutionary Army commander. It was Momonosuke, Shogun of Wano. A 20-year-old who had survived more than most people survived in a lifetime, and who was currently trying to rebuild a country while the people who had destroyed it were pivoting to do something worse. The justification listed was destabilizing influence on post-emperor transition, potential regional power consolidation. Translated from the language of official documentation, he was young, he had a country, and he was already demonstrating that he intended to keep it. Fujitora sat with his cane in his hands and thought about this for a while. He thought about the formal objection he'd filed 3 days ago, which was now sitting in Sakazuki's administrative record like a piece of furniture that everyone stepped around. He thought about duty, which was a concept he'd been carrying for his entire adult life, and which had never felt as heavy or as poorly defined as it felt right now. He thought about a man who had chosen to blind himself, voluntarily, deliberately, with full understanding of what he was doing and why, because he had decided that if he kept his eyes open he would be unable to do what needed to be done. He thought about what that said about him. He'd always framed it as a personal failing, a confession of weakness. He hadn't wanted to see the things he was going to be asked to see as an admiral, so he'd removed the mechanism. He thought now, sitting with the roster in his hands, about whether there was a version of that story where the blinding was not a confession, but a commitment. Where it meant not I cannot bear to see this but I have already decided what I will not look at, and I am keeping that decision. He stood up. He tapped his cane twice on the floor, which was his habitual way of initiating movement. He went to the communications room. He sent 2 messages. The first was to Momonosuke. It was brief and had no official header, which meant it would not appear in the marine communication logs. It said, "Be ready to move your people inland. You have 12 hours before something I cannot prevent reaches your coast." The second message was to an address in the Grand Line that was not a Marine address and was not a Revolutionary Army address but was a third category of contact that Fujitora had been maintaining for 7 months with the careful secrecy of a man who had not yet decided whether to use it but had known, somewhere below the level of conscious decision, that the day was going to come. The message said, "I need to speak to the Straw Hats. Directly. Securely. Not as an admiral. As a man. Isho." He sent both messages. He went back to his quarters. He sat down. He poured himself a glass of something, and he drank it, and he put the glass down, and he thought about what he had just done and whether it was the right thing. He concluded that he didn't know. He concluded that not knowing was itself information, that if the choice were clearly right, he would have made it earlier, and that if it were clearly wrong, the thing in his chest that had always functioned as his internal compass would have told him so. The fact of the uncertainty meant he was in the territory where all the important decisions lived, the gray space where the answers weren't given and had to be made. He'd made the choice. He sat with it. Outside his porthole, the sea was doing what it always did. They were 6 hours out of Wano, in open ocean with a favorable wind and a course that Nami had already revised twice for optimal current usage, when the secondary Den Mushi, the encoded frequency, started ringing with an address none of them recognized. Nami stared at it. Law appeared at her shoulder, because Law had the specific instinct of a man who had spent years tracking signals that other people didn't notice. That encoding, he said. He picked up the snail without asking, which Nami allowed because she was also looking at the encoding and it had already told her something she hadn't expected. That's a marine cipher. Fleet level, Nami said. No. Law's voice was careful. Admiral level. They looked at each other. Zoro appeared from nowhere, the way he appeared from nowhere, standing at Nami's other shoulder. Answer it. She pressed the activation point. Thank you for picking up. The voice was older, male, measured in the way of someone who had been choosing words carefully for decades. I'll be brief. My name is Isho. I'm currently ranked as, I know who you are, Nami said. A pause. Then you know why calling you represents a significant personal departure for me. I won't explain myself at length. I'm going to tell you one thing that I believe you need to know, and one thing that I want to ask. Talk, Zoro said. A brief silence that might have been surprise at the directness, and then. The secondary operations protocol has been escalated. Sakazuki is moving faster than the original timeline. Your engagement at Wano accelerated his decision. He's adding 4 locations to the first phase target list, including Momonosuke. I've warned Wano directly, but that only buys time. Another pause. And the Straw Hat crew specifically has been elevated to Priority 1, authorized for lethal engagement, which means the next admiral he sends won't hold back for a calculation. The next encounter will be absolute. The deck was quiet. The wind moved through the sails. The thing I want to ask, Fujitora said. Where are you going? Nami looked at Zoro. Zoro looked at the horizon. Why do you want to know? Zoro said. Because I have a decision to make that depends on it. If you're going somewhere that can change the nature of this conflict fundamentally, not just the current engagement, but the underlying structure of it, then my decision is one thing. If you're going somewhere tactical, my decision is another thing. What's the decision? Whether to resign my commission, Fujitora said plainly, and what to do afterward. Silence. Usopp, from somewhere behind Nami, said very quietly, Is an admiral about to defect to us? Quiet, Nami said. She looked at the Den Mushi. Admiral Fujitora. We're going to Laugh Tale. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to be significant. Rogers Island, he said. Yes. And you believe you'll find something there that changes the conflict structurally. We believe we'll find something that changes the world's understanding of what the conflict actually is. Robin said from where she was sitting 4 feet away with the specific quality of attention she gave conversations that mattered. Another long pause. When Fujitora spoke again, his voice had shifted in a way that was difficult to describe, not louder, not warmer, but somehow more present, like he moved closer to whatever the microphone in the Den Mushi was. Then go fast, he said. I'll do what I can from my end. I can't promise coordination. I'm not willing to engage my colleagues directly. But I can create friction. Bureaucratic, logistical, institutional friction. I'm very good at friction. A pause that contained something almost dry. I've been filing objections for years. I know where to put them so they cost the most time. That might actually be worth something, Law said. Trafalgar Law. Fujitora seemed to place the voice. I won't pretend I'm comfortable with everything your alliance represents. I won't pretend I'm comfortable with everything a sitting admiral represents, Law said. But here we are. Here we are. A brief sound that might have been Fujitora's version of a rueful acknowledgement. One more thing. Sakazuki is preparing something for the Grand Line. I don't have specifics yet. The operational details haven't come through my command chain because he's correctly identified that my chain is unreliable at this point. But the scale of the resource allocation suggests it's significant. Be prepared for something larger than the Wano engagement. How large? Nami asked. Buster call large, Fujitora said. Possibly larger. He disconnected. The crew stood with that information for a moment. Buster call, Usopp said, at the appropriate volume for the information. He said possibly larger. Chopper said. Right. Usopp sat down. Frankie, Zoro said. What's the Sunny's maximum speed under optimal conditions? Frankie's jaw was set. With the coup de burst and the right current? Faster than a Buster call can deploy. Then we stay ahead of it. Zoro looked at Nami. Optimal conditions. I'm already on it, she said, moving to the helm. 3 days into the journey to Laugh Tale, in the middle of a calm night watch with Brook playing soft violin somewhere below and the stars occupying their usual improbable density over the Grand Line, Law came and sat near Zoro on the forward deck without being invited, which meant he had something to say that he decided warranted the slight social awkwardness of the approach. Zoro waited. I knew him, Law said. Luffy. Not well. Not in the way your crew knew him. But I knew him in the specific way of someone who spent time in his proximity and couldn't figure out how to remain unaffected by it. He looked at the water. He asked me once why I was doing what I was doing. The alliance, the plan against Doflamingo, all of it. He asked in that way he had, where the question was completely sincere but also clearly expected an answer that went past the stated justification. A pause. I told him it was about Khorasan. About revenge. He accepted that, and then he looked at me like he was waiting for the rest of it, and the rest of it was. He stopped. Zoro looked at him sideways. The rest of it was that I'd stopped wanting to die somewhere around the 2nd month of being in his orbit. Law said flatly, like a man reading from a document he'd rather not be reading. Which I hadn't told anyone and didn't particularly want to examine. He just waited for it, like he already knew it was there. He paused. He was annoying like that. Yeah, Zoro said. I'm telling you this because... Law paused again, with the specific hesitation of someone who rarely explains their reasons and is aware they're doing something unusual. Because I want you to understand that what we're doing isn't purely tactical for me. I have tactical reasons. I also have the other kind. Zoro looked at the water. You didn't have to explain that. No. I know. Law folded his hands. I'm explaining it anyway. Zoro nodded once slowly, in the way that served as acknowledgement and acceptance and the verbal equivalent of you're good, we don't need to talk about it more. Law received it as exactly that, which was why, despite everything, these two worked together as well as they did. They sat in silence for a while. The violin below continued its soft conversation with the dark. The transmission tower, Law said eventually. If it works. If Robin's right and the signal goes out. What about it? The world hearing the truth about the Void Century doesn't automatically fix anything. People don't change because they learn something. They change because learning something makes certain positions untenable. He looked at the stars. Sakazuki won't stop. Even if the broadcast happens, even if the world knows what the celestial dragons are, and what the world government was founded on, men like him don't stop. He'll call it propaganda. He'll call it the fabrication of criminals. He'll have a counter-narrative ready in hours. I know. So we need to be ready for what comes after the broadcast. We need something on the board that the counter-narrative can't answer. Law looked at Zoro. The broadcast changes the world's understanding. But someone still has to make the physical argument. Zoro's hand rested on Enma's hilt, not with intent but with the easy familiarity of long association. Yeah. Someone does. Law looked at the hand on the sword. He thought about Corazon, about a man who had died smiling because a child was running away safely, about the specific quality of sacrifice that was motivated not by duty or ideology but by something simpler and more durable. He thought about a rubber-armed idiot who had looked at him, Law, possibly the most contained and self-sufficient person he'd ever met, and waited for the real answer with complete patience. You're going to fight Sakazuki, Law said. We're going to fight Sakazuki. Zoro corrected. I meant you specifically. Zoro shrugged. If it comes to that. It will come to that. Then it does. He removed his hand from Enma's hilt and crossed his arms. He killed Ace, Zoro said. He's the reason Luffy spent 2 years training in complete isolation, carrying that. He's the reason a lot of things are the way they are. A pause. I'm not going to fight him because of Luffy. I'm going to fight him because he needs to be fought, and I'm the one who can do it. He looked at the stars. Luffy would have wanted to do it himself. But Luffy's not here, so I'm doing it instead, and that's not about Luffy. That's about the world being the kind of place where the next crew after us can sail without someone like Sakazuki deciding who gets to be free. Law was quiet. That's either the most straightforward thing anyone has ever said to me, he said, or the most profound. I genuinely can't tell. Probably both, Zoro said. Go to sleep, Law. Law went. Zoro stayed up for the rest of the watch. On the 4th day, Sabo made his move. It happened on 6 islands simultaneously, which was the kind of operational coordination that the Revolutionary Army had been building toward for years and which the current moment had finally made both necessary and justified. On Logtown, Pucci, Sabaody, and 3 others whose names meant less than their strategic positions, Revolutionary Army cells that had been dormant, or operating at the lowest detectable level suddenly became very visible. Not violent. Not primarily. The approach was more elegant than that, and Sabo, who had grown up studying strategy because it was the one form of power available to a child with nothing, had designed the approach himself. Mass public simultaneous declarations. On every island, at the same hour, by pre-agreed signal, every revolutionary contact, small business people, dock workers, minor officials, common people who had been quietly affiliated for years, came forward publicly and said, I am a revolutionary. I am here. I am not going anywhere. The effect was not military. It was demographic. The world government's immediate reflex was to suppress, which they did, but suppressing 1,000 visible individuals on 6 islands simultaneously stretched their enforcement bandwidth in ways that were felt everywhere else. Marine units assigned to surveillance roles in the Grand Line got reallocated to civilian suppression. Intelligence resources pulled toward tracking the expanded revolutionary presence couldn't simultaneously track a specific ship moving at speed through the southern approach to Laugh Tale. It worked exactly as designed. It was also real people taking real risk with real consequences, and Sabo knew that, and it sat with him in the way that all real costs sat with him, weighed and acknowledged and carried. Koala watched the reports coming in from their position in a borrowed revolutionary vessel 50 miles from the Sabaody operation. Her face was the face of someone monitoring something that mattered to her, and accepting that monitoring was all she could do right now. The Sabaody cell is intact, she said, reading the incoming signal. Logtown lost 4 people to Marine custody. Pucci is holding. She looked up. The Marine reallocation is happening. Grand Line surveillance is down to 60% of previous coverage. Sabo nodded. The window's open. For now. She set the report down. Sabo. The people in custody in Logtown. We need an extraction plan. It's already written. He put a hand on her shoulder briefly, the gesture of someone who understood what she was asking and was asking it back, in the same physical language. Nobody gets left. I know. I just needed to hear it. I know. He moved to the chart table. What's the Tang's last position? Following the Sunny. They should be approaching the second surveillance zone in. She checked. 9 hours. Fujitora's friction is holding? For now. There's an Admiral-level deployment request sitting in the administrative queue with 4 separate procedural objections attached to it, each of which requires individual response before authorization can proceed. Whoever filed the objections knows the system very well. Ijoji, Sabo said, with something approaching warmth. Good. He looked at the chart. At the route to Laugh Tale, the line of it running through contested water toward the end of the world. At the small mark he'd made on the chart that indicated the Sunny's last known position, moving fast, moving towards something that he understood now was the actual culmination of everything Roger had started, everything Dragon had dedicated his life to building toward, everything that Luffy had been sailing for without needing to know precisely what the destination contained. He put his finger on the mark. He held it there for a moment, the specific gesture of a man touching a map at the place where the person he loves most is. Then he moved his hand. He picked up the operations pen. He kept working. Sakazuki received the reports from 6 different islands in 6 different formats, and processed them with the methodical attention he gave everything significant, which meant he let the whole picture assemble before he responded to any part of it. He was patient. He was always patient. It was the quality about himself that he trusted most, the one that had never failed him even when everything else in a situation had. The Revolutionary Army's visible deployment was a distraction. He knew it was a distraction because it was too coordinated and too legible, and the Revolutionary Army's intelligence capability meant that if Sable wanted something suppressed, it would already be suppressed. This was deliberate visibility, which meant it was a screen for something else. The something else was the Straw Hat crew. He pulled up the Grand Line surveillance reports. The coverage gap was small but present, a corridor of reduced monitoring in the southern approach. He pulled up the last known positions of the Thousand Sunny and the Polar Tang. He calculated the speed they'd been making based on reported sightings. He drew the trajectory forward, through the corridor, to its logical terminus. Laugh Tail. He sat with that for a moment. He was a man who did not experience surprise easily. He experienced it now, briefly, as a recalibration, a revision of his model of what the Straw Hats were doing and why. He'd been tracking them as a tactical threat. He revised that now. They weren't a tactical threat. They were something else. They were moving toward the structural foundation of the entire conflict, towards something that had been sitting at the end of the Grand Line for 800 years, and they had apparently figured out what it was. Nico Robin. Of course. Of course it was Robin. He stood and walked to the window. The question now was not how to stop the secondary operations or how to neutralize the Revolutionary Army's visibility campaign. The question was how to reach Laugh Tail before the Straw Hat crew did, or, his second option, which he began constructing simultaneously, how to ensure that whatever they found there couldn't be used in the way they intended to use it. He turned from the window. "Get me Kizaru," he said, to the runner at the door. "And get me the Buster Call authorization for Grand Line Sector 7. Full deployment." He paused. "Maximum speed." The runner left at something close to running. Sakazuki stood in his office with his hands behind his back and looked at the empty space in front of him where his model of the conflict was currently being revised, and he felt something that he rarely felt and did not entirely welcome, the sensation of a situation that was moving faster than his control of it. He tightened his jaw. He controlled it. He always controlled it. The world was going to be what it was supposed to be because he was going to make it so, and he was going to make it so because he had decided to, and he had decided to because it was right, and it was right because the logic held. He built it carefully. It held. He went to work. That night, in the bunk room of the Thousand Sunny, with the ship moving at speed through the dark and the Grand Line doing its grand, chaotic, magnificent worst around them, weather systems that changed by the hour, currents that argued with each other, the general extraordinary hostility of the world's most extreme ocean. Nami sat cross-legged on her bunk with the course chart in her lap and her pencil behind her ear and didn't sleep. She was thinking about a map she'd once drawn. Not a navigation map, a different one. One she'd drawn when she was a child on Kokoyashi, sitting on the floor of the house she shared with Belmere, using a piece of charcoal and a floorboard as canvas, because there wasn't money for proper cartography paper and she'd wanted to draw the world anyway. She'd drawn it from memory and imagination, filling in the ocean she'd never seen and the islands she'd only heard about, labeling them with names she'd read in whatever books she could find. It was a terrible map, technically. The proportions were wrong and half the locations were invented or misremembered. Belmere had looked at it and said it was the best map she'd ever seen, and Nami had known even at 8 years old that this was love rather than geography, but she'd kept the map anyway until the day she couldn't keep it anymore. She thought about that map. About the girl who drew it. About the woman she'd become, who could navigate by stars and current, and the color of deep water and the behavior of birds, and who had, over the past 2 years, plotted courses through every kind of impossible and found the way through all of them. She thought about where this route ended. About a tower 800 years old. About the truth of the world going out across every ocean at once. She put the pencil to the chart and adjusted the course by 2 degrees, picking up a favorable current she'd spotted in the star behavior 3 hours ago and been waiting to confirm. The calculation held. She'd pick up half a day on the current if the weather held, and the weather was going to hold because she'd been reading it for the past 12 hours and it had the specific shape of something that intended to cooperate. She rolled the chart. She put it on the shelf. She lay down. She didn't sleep for another hour, but lying down was a start. In the main mast, the straw hat flag moved in the dark wind, present and visible, carrying the specific meaning it had always carried, that this crew was here, and moving, and entirely too stubborn to do anything other than what they'd set out to do. Somewhere ahead, at the end of the world, something waited that could change everything. They were coming. Fast and without apology. The way they always came. Chapter 5. The End of the World. They saw Laughtail on the 9th day. It appeared through the morning mist the way things appear when you've been sailing toward them long enough that seeing them feels less like arrival and more like recognition. A dark mass in the silver-white distance, growing definition as the sunny cut toward it, resolving from shape into texture, from texture into geography. Cliffs and green. A harbor that Roger had found first and that no one else had reached since, because the route was the route and the route was impossible unless you were the kind of people for whom impossible was a navigational category rather than a stopping point. Nami had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 4 days, and she stood at the helm and looked at the island coming clear through the mist and didn't say anything for a long moment. Her eyes were doing something complicated that she kept mostly internal. Then she said quietly, to nobody specific, "There it is." Frankie, beside her, took off his sunglasses. Nobody else spoke. The sunny moved through the last of the mist, and the island came fully into view, not enormous, not dramatic in the way of legendary places that arrange themselves to communicate their significance. Just an island. Green and steep and real, with a harbor below the cliffs that still showed the marks of a ship having been there long ago, the weathered posts of an old mooring visible above the water line. Roger's ship had been here. The marks it left were still in the stone. Law surfaced the Tang 50 meters to their port side, conning tower appearing without drama, Beepo's white head visible briefly before disappearing below. Law himself came up and stood at the tower's edge and looked at the island with the particular stillness he reserved for things that required actual gravity. "We go in carefully," Nami said, moving to the bow to read the water. "I don't know the harbor depth and I'm not losing the Sunny on a reef 2,000 miles from anyone who can fix her." "We have the Tang," Law said across the water. "She can navigate shallow harbor. Let us go first." "Go," Nami said. The submarine eased forward, moving slow and deliberate, and the Sunny followed in her wake, using the Tang's depth reading to stay in safe water. The harbor opened as they came in, wider than it looked from outside, sheltered by the cliff geometry in a way that made it naturally calm, the water inside almost flat despite the swell running outside. They anchored side by side. The island was quiet. Not the silence of a place that was empty, a different quality, the silence of a place that had been waiting, that had the stillness of things with patience long enough to encompass centuries. "Everyone who's coming, comes now," Zoro said. He was already checking his swords, the habitual motion, blade seated, release smooth, weight confirmed. "We don't know what's on this island or who else knows we're here. Move fast and stay together." They went in 2 groups, Zoro, Robin, Nami, Law from the Sunny, Law's crew member Beepo, Penguin and Shachi staying with the ships on guard rotation. Sanji, Frankie, Chopper, and Brook came behind, Chopper with his medical bag already out and Frankie with the quiet, focused energy of an engineer approaching something he hadn't seen yet but already respected. Usopp stayed on the Sunny with the specific dignity of a man who had been asked to guard the ship rather than explore an uncharted legendary island, and was absolutely fine with this and not at all bothered. "I'm the last line of defense," he said to himself, firmly, and checked his slingshot, and went to stand watch at the bow where he could see the harbor entrance and also, if the angle was right, the cliff path where the others were climbing. The path up the cliff was old. Not a built path. A natural one, worn by use into the rock over centuries, possibly by the island's original inhabitants, possibly by Roger's crew, possibly by both. It switchbacked up the eastern face and emerged on a plateau above the harbor that was dense with vegetation but not impassable, the kind of green that grows in undisturbed places, indifferent and non-hostile. Robin walked ahead of the group, which was the correct configuration because she was the one who knew what they were looking for. She moved through the vegetation with the specific confident economy of a woman who had spent her life in places that weren't on maps, reading environments that didn't have signs. She stopped at the edge of a clearing. The structure was not what any of them had imagined, which meant each of them had been imagining something different, and all of those imaginations were wrong in roughly the same direction, too dramatic, too obviously significant. The actual structure was low and broad, built from the same dark stone as the island's cliffs, almost entirely reclaimed by the vegetation that had grown over and around and through it over 8 centuries. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd walk past it as a geological feature. But Robin knew to look for it. She'd described its location from the Poneglyph's coordinate encoding in a conversation with Nami 2 nights ago, and the coordinates had been precise, and this was the location. "There," she said. They looked at it. Law walked forward and crouched beside the nearest section, running his fingers along the edge where the stone met the rude work. "This is old. Older than anything I've seen built. 800 years, Robin said. "Give or take. The materials are the same as the Poneglyphs." He stood. "It's not just a building. This is a Poneglyph-class construction." "Yes. Which means it's intact." The ancient kingdom's architects built for permanence specifically because they knew what was coming. She moved along the structure's edge, looking for the entrance she'd calculated from the coordinate encoding. Here. The entrance was a low opening in the stone, not sealed but covered by generations of vegetation. Frankie cleared it in 30 seconds, working fast and careful, not damaging the structure. Inside was dark. Chopper made a light from his medical kit, a chemical lamp, cold and white. They went in. The room was not large. It didn't need to be. What it contained was the entirety of its purpose, arranged with the specific clarity of people who had known they were leaving something important, and had organized it accordingly. One wall was solid text, not carved into the surface but inlaid, the characters raised rather than incised, in a material that had survived 8 centuries without losing definition. This was the ancient script, the full dialect, and Robin stood in front of it and read it, and the rest of them stood behind her and waited. She read for 4 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved unnecessarily. Chopper held the lamp. Frankie stood completely still, which was the most remarkable part of the whole moment because Frankie was almost never completely still. Robin turned around. Her face was the face of a woman who has arrived at the place she has been traveling toward for her entire adult life, and found it to be real, and is now holding the weight of that in her hands and figuring out what to do with it. "It's all here," she said. Her voice was steady. "The complete history. The ancient kingdom, the alliance of 20, the formation of the world government, how it happened, why it happened, who made each decision and what the actual stated justifications were at the time versus what the records that survived say." She paused. "The celestial dragons. Their actual lineage and the specific acts of the original founding families that got written out of the official record." Another pause. And a message. From the last leader of the ancient kingdom. Not encoded. Written in a language that was already old when they wrote it, preserved in this material so it would last. Written directly to whoever came here and found this. "What does it say?" Nami asked. Robin looked at her. "It says, we could not stop what was coming. We have left you the truth because the truth is the only weapon that cannot be taken from you. Use it when the world is ready. Do not wait until you are safe. The world will never be safe enough if you wait for safety. Use it when the world is listening. That is the only requirement. Find the voice, speak the truth, and let the world decide. We believed in the next age. We have always believed in it. That belief is the One Piece. The room was very quiet. Zoro said nothing. He looked at the text on the wall, at the language he couldn't read but whose existence he could feel the weight of, and something moved in his face that he let move and didn't try to manage. Sanji had come in behind the first group and he was standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his cigarette unlit, and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was feeling something he didn't have words for. Brook made a sound. Small and involuntary and entirely Brook. The One Piece, Nami said quietly. Not a question. Processing. The will of D, Robin said. This is what it means. The will to carry this forward. To find this place and use what's here, and not stop until it's done. She looked at each of them. Roger found this. He understood what it meant and he laughed. He laughed because the weight of it was so enormous, and so exactly what he'd been sailing toward that laughter was the only response that was large enough. She paused. Luffy would have laughed. He would have had his mouth full. Sanji said, automatically, and then stopped, and then pressed his lips together. Yeah, Zoro said. The tower was on the island's western side, accessed from the plateau through a second path that Robin located from the coordinate encoding within 20 minutes of leaving the chamber. It was more visible than the chamber had been. It rose above the treeline, and from the right angle on the cliffs you could see its top, which was why the crew had seen something they'd each assumed was a natural rock formation on the approach. Up close, it was clearly not natural. It was built from the same indestructible stone, tapered rather than straight, covered in the same inlaid script, and at its base was a mechanism that Frankie spent 6 minutes examining with the focused intensity of a man falling in love with something he doesn't entirely understand yet. It's a resonance amplifier, he said. The design is, I've never seen anything like this. But the principle is, it uses the island's own geography as part of the transmission structure. The cliffs, the water, the rock formation underneath, they're all part of it. He stood up. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with his technical modifications and everything to do with genuine wonder. If this thing is what you say it is, Robin, and it's functional, which I think it might be, I need 30 minutes to verify the activation sequence, then the broadcast radius from this position, amplified through the island's geography and using the Grand Line's atmospheric conductivity. He stopped. He ran the calculation again in his head. It would reach every ocean. Every ocean, Nami said. Every ocean. Every receiver. Every marine ship, every pirate ship, every port authority station, every private den mushy setup, any vessel in range of any island in range of. He stopped again. Everything. Robin was already examining the tower's base mechanism beside him, reading the script on the activation sequence with the quick, absorbed attention she gave texts that she needed to understand fast. The power source is internal. It's Law. Law stepped forward. The activation mechanism describes a resonance initiation. A specific frequency produced by. She looked at the mechanism. By a devil fruit. Specifically a type that can manipulate spatial frequency at a molecular level. She looked at Law. Room. At full output, focused into this mechanism. Law looked at the tower. At the mechanism. He pulled on his gloves. Show me where. Robin showed him. He crouched and examined it, tracing the lines of the inlaid script with one finger, reading the physical geometry of the mechanism with the precision of a surgeon reading anatomy. He stood up. I can do it, he said. But I'll need 15 minutes of sustained output. At that level my room won't be combat capable afterward. Not for several hours. We'll cover you, Zoro said immediately. I know. I'm not asking for assurance, I'm telling you the tactical status so you can plan accordingly. He looked at Zoro. If something comes while I'm running the initiation, handle it. Law nodded once. Then we need the content. The content is the chamber recording, Robin said. I need to transfer it. There's an interface at the tower's base. She moved to it, found it, and her expression clarified in the way of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed. Here. This is how they plan to use it. The chamber and the tower are connected by the same encoding system. It's not a separate broadcast, it's the chamber's content, transmitted through the tower, in the original language plus what I believe is an auto-translation protocol embedded in the ancient encoding. Auto-translation, Nami said. The ancient kingdom anticipated this moment across every possible future, including ones where the people who arrived here didn't speak the original language, Robin said. They built the translation into the mechanism. She looked up. They were very thorough. 800 years thorough, Frankie said, with the respect of one engineer for another separated by 8 centuries. Frankie, Robin said. The activation sequence after Law initializes it. Can you read it from this specification? Frankie crouched beside her. Read the mechanism details she was pointing to. Stood up. Yes. Then we do it in sequence. She looked around at all of them. Law initializes. Frankie activates. The content transfers from the chamber encoding through the tower. And the world hears the truth of the void century. She paused. Before we do this, I want everyone to understand what it means. This is not reversible. Once the broadcast happens, there is no version of events where the world government can put this back. What follows will be chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous. The world will be different in ways we can't fully model. Good, Zoro said. Robin looked at him. The ghost of a real smile. Yes, she said. Good. Then let's do it, Nami said. Now, while we still have the window. They didn't have the window for as long as they'd hoped. Beepo's voice came through the den mushy 20 seconds after Law had begun his room, a sphere of surgical light expanding from his hands, the spatial manipulation running at a depth that made the air inside it look slightly wrong, the tower's base mechanism beginning to hum at a frequency you felt more than heard. Ships, Beepo said. His voice was Beepo's voice, which meant it carried its emotion at the surface without apology. A lot of ships. Coming from the north. How many? Nami said. 8. 10. I'm still counting. Usopp says at least 12. Usopp's right. Usopp said in the background of the transmission, at a volume that suggested he was prioritizing accuracy over composure. I count 14. And one of them is, Nami, one of them is flying the fleet admiral's flag. Nami looked at Zoro. Sakazuki, Zoro said. He figured it out. She said. He figured out Laugh Tale. She looked at Law, who was inside his room and running the initiation with the focused completeness of a man who had committed to something and was not going to stop for anything short of structural impossibility. She looked at Frankie, who was reading the activation sequence and was already moving to his position. She looked at Robin, who had moved to the chamber interface and was beginning the content transfer with the precise, practiced movements of a woman doing the most important thing she has ever done. She looked at Zoro. How long do they need? He said. Law's initiation, 10 more minutes minimum. Frankie's sequence once Law finishes, 5 minutes. Transfer, unknown, but Robin's fast. She thought. 20 minutes. Best case. Zoro looked at the harbor below. At the bay's entrance. At the specific geography of the cliffs and the water and the approach that any fleet would have to take to reach the island. The harbor entrance is narrow, he said. Very. Nami confirmed, because she had read the harbor on approach and the harbor was in her head the way all navigated geography lived in her head, perfectly and permanently. One ship at a time, Zoro said. If that. He looked at Sanji. Sanji was already looking at him with the cigarette finally lit and his hands loosening in his coat pockets, the physical language of a man moving from standby to operational. You and me, Zoro said. Sanji raised an eyebrow. At the harbor entrance? We hold it for 20 minutes. Sanji took the cigarette from his mouth. Looked at it. Put it back. Just 20? L'll be done in 10. Right, so really we just need to hold off a world government fleet with an admiral for 20 minutes, Zoro said. Sanji looked at the harbor entrance. At the approaching shapes of 14 marine warships beginning to resolve through the distance. At the sky above, which was the specific color of mid-morning blue, clear and deep and completely indifferent to the conflict taking shape beneath it. I'll take the left side, Sanji said. I'll take everything else, Zoro said. That's not how splitting works. Take the left side. Sanji looked at him for a half-second longer, and something passed between them that was not friendship in any conventional sense but was the thing that exists between people who have been in enough genuine danger together that the categories of like and dislike have been replaced by something more durable and less comfortable. Don't get in my way, Sanji said. They moved. The harbor entrance was 40 meters wide at its narrowest, flanked on both sides by cliff faces that dropped straight to the water. Zoro stood on the eastern cliff edge, 20 feet above the water line, and watched the first marine warship trying to enter. It was a large ship, battle-class, twin-masted, running marine colors at both mastheads. It came through the entrance at reduced speed, which was correct seamanship in an unfamiliar narrow harbor, and that reduced speed was the first problem it encountered. The second problem it encountered was Zoro. He came off the cliff edge without announcement, landing on the ship's foredeck with the impact of something considerably heavier than one man, and his 3 swords were out before he'd finished absorbing the landing, and the crew of the battle-class warship had approximately 2 seconds to understand what was on their deck before those 2 seconds were over. He didn't sink the ship. Sinking the ship would block the entrance and prevent subsequent ships from entering, which would make his job easier but would also prevent the fleet from dispersing into the harbor. And a fleet that couldn't enter the harbor was a fleet that could sit at the entrance and deploy marines on small boats, and generally make things complicated in ways that were harder to manage than a direct engagement. He was not there to sink ships. He was there to cost time. The engagement on the first ship lasted 4 minutes. Not because of any difficulty. The crew was capable and numerous and professional, and none of it was any of those things enough. He was on the second ship in the time it took the first crew to understand the first ship had been disabled rather than destroyed. The second ship's captain was smarter, and had seen what happened to the first ship and was already trying to reverse course in the narrow entrance, which was a good decision executed too late. On the western cliff above the entrance, Sanji was a different kind of weather entirely. He moved through the air with the specific, self-contained precision of someone who had made the sky his native element, his kicks landing on ship structures and weapons and people with the exact calculated force of someone who knew precisely how much damage was useful and how much was waste. He didn't make noise when he fought, not the shouting of technique names, not the grunting of effort. He worked in a focused, almost private silence that was completely at odds with how Sanji presented himself in every other context. And if you didn't know him, you might not understand that the silence meant he was taking it seriously. He was taking it seriously. 3 ships were stalled at or near the entrance by the 7-minute mark. The 4th and 5th were trying to maneuver around each other, and the stopped ships in water that was too narrow for that kind of maneuver, creating the specific maritime chaos of too many large vessels in too small a space all trying to do different things simultaneously. 14 ships. 7 minutes. And then the water near the entrance changed. It moved differently, not the wave motion of ships or the churn of their engines but a lateral displacement, massive and smooth, the signature of something enormous moving through the water at depth at great speed and decelerating. Fleet Admiral Sakazuki surfaced on a platform of solidified magma that he'd pushed up from the water 60 meters from the harbor entrance. He looked at the entrance, at the stalled ships, at the 2 figures moving through the engagement with the professional efficiency of a very specific kind of danger. He looked at Zoro. "Roranoa," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need volume. His voice carried with the same quality as his presence, by weight rather than projection. Zoro landed on the cliff edge and looked back at him across the water. He was breathing. Genuinely working, not performing ease. Sakazuki was not Ryukugyu, and the encounter's physics would be different. Fleet Admiral, Zoro said. You're buying time, Sakazuki said. For whatever is happening on this island. I know this because I am not an idiot and you are not subtle. He stepped off his magma platform onto the cliff, which required a 4-meter step that he executed without apparent effort. How long do you need? 12 more minutes, Zoro said, because lying would have been pointless and because Sakazuki was the kind of opponent who deserved the honest answer. Sakazuki looked at him. Something moved in his expression, small and genuine, not respect exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of an honest man by another honest man who happened to be standing on the opposite side of an enormous question. I can't let you have 12 minutes, he said. I know, Zoro said. That's why I'm not asking. Enma came out. Sakazuki was everything that the intelligence profiles and the survivor accounts and the collective reputation of 20 years said he was. And he was more than that, and the more was the thing that couldn't be transmitted in any description but only encountered directly. He moved like consequence. Not fast, exactly. The speed was there, the Admiral-class speed that made normal human velocity look like standing still, but the weight of him was what registered. Every strike was absolute. There was no preliminary. There was no fainting for information. He fought the way he made decisions, directly, completely, with the full commitment of a man who didn't do anything partially. The magma came in two forms: the direct thermal weaponry that melted stone on contact and turned air to superheated gas, and the environmental control, the reshaping of the physical space into something inhospitable to anything but himself. The cliff edge was becoming a different thing under the engagement, black and slag-scarred, remade by contact with the fight. Zoro moved through it the way he moved through everything, by being at the place where the strike had already been and was no longer. His haki was black over all 3 blades within the first 20 seconds, which was not a considered decision but an automatic calibration to the level of the threat, the way your grip tightens when the thing you're holding is very heavy. Enma in particular was doing something that it occasionally did in high-intensity engagements, pulling the haki harder than he intended, taking more than he wanted to give, drinking from him at a depth that would become a problem if the fight ran long. He fed it what it wanted. He had 12 minutes, and he was going to give the sword whatever it needed to make those 12 minutes count. The first real exchange, the moment where both combatants stopped assessing and committed, happened at the 2-minute mark. And it was the kind of moment that the Marines on the ships at the harbor entrance stopped what they were doing to watch, because the physical result of it was visible from 50 meters. 2 shockwaves intersecting at the point of contact and going outward in opposite directions. The cliff edge taking the concussive force and losing a section of itself to the water. Below. Sakazuki didn't step back. Zoro didn't step back. They looked at each other across the space of the exchange. You're extraordinary, Sakazuki said. The flattery was not flattery. It was an assessment delivered in the direct language of a man incapable of dishonesty even in combat. You're not going to stop me. I'm not trying to stop you, Zoro said. I'm trying to slow you down. He brought Enma up. 12 minutes is 12 minutes. On the island's western plateau, the tower was humming. Law's room was holding at full output, his jaw set and his eyes open and his hands maintaining the frequency with the kind of sustained effort that made the air around him shimmer slightly, the spatial manipulation running deep enough to affect the island's own geological resonance. Beads of sweat on his temples. Breathing measured and controlled because if the breathing went the output went. 8 minutes in. Frankie was at the activation mechanism, his augmented hands interfacing with the ancient technology in the specific way that only worked because Frankie's enhancements were, in some fundamental way, the same philosophy as the ancient engineers: build it to last, build it to matter, build it with everything you have. He was reading the sequence as Law's initiation completed it section by section, feeding the activation at the rate the mechanism required. Robin was at the chamber interface. The content was transferring. She could see it moving through the encoding system, not visually but structurally, the way you see the flow of something through its effect on the medium it's moving through. The void centuries complete history. The names, the dates, the acts, the truths. 800 years of suppressed reality moving through ancient stone toward a tower that had been waiting to speak it. She kept her hands on the interface. She read the transfer status and the script the mechanism displayed. She thought about Professor Clover, who had died for knowing a fraction of this. She thought about O'Hara, which she had survived and which the world had lost. She thought about every scholar who had touched this history and paid for it. She kept her hands on the interface. Nami was standing watch at the plateau's edge, watching the harbor below with a scope and relaying to the Den machine clipped, precise navigation speak, ship positions, movement vectors, the status of the engagement at the entrance. She watched Zoro fight Sakazuki and kept her voice completely level and didn't let herself think about what she was watching, because thinking about it would cost something she needed right now. Chopper was beside her. He wasn't watching the harbor. He was watching Nami, with the specific attentiveness of a doctor who has decided that the most important patient in his immediate environment is the one who's choosing not to ask for help. He didn't say anything. He just stayed close. Brook was on the cliff above the harbor, playing his violin. Nobody had asked him to. He'd climbed up there with his violin while the others were positioning, and he'd started playing, and the music that came out was something that had no name in any genre. It was the music of the specific moment, of loss and forward motion and the sea and 8 people doing the thing that needed doing in the only way they knew how. The Marines on the ships below the cliff heard it. Some of them stopped what they were doing. Not because it stopped them tactically, but because music that true reaches into people and takes hold of something that tactics don't reach, and the hold surprised them. Brook played. The tower hummed. Law held. At the 9-minute mark, Sakazuki changed what he was doing. He stopped pressing the direct engagement, and shifted, the magma going environmental, spreading across the cliff face and the plateau edge in a deliberate barrier, cutting off the path from the harbor entrance to the island's interior. He wasn't trying to defeat Zoro. He was trying to go around him. Zoro saw it in the 3rd second of the shift. "No," he said and moved. What followed was not a sword technique with an aim. It was the application of 3 swords at full hockey output in a pattern that was aimed not at Sakazuki but at the magma barrier, at the geological structure of the barrier, at the specific points where it was weakest in its setting, at the places where a cut of sufficient depth and precision would collapse it back into the water rather than letting it set. He cut the barrier 4 times. Moving parallel to Sakazuki rather than engaging him directly, covering distance he couldn't have covered in a direct exchange. Sakazuki watched him do it. Something moved in the Fleet Admiral's expression, something that in a different man might have been frustration, and in Sakazuki was the honest acknowledgement of an obstacle being managed more competently than expected. He increased the magma output. The barrier rebuilt faster than Zoro could cut it. Zoro cut faster. They were 3 meters apart, and neither was looking at the other, and both were completely focused on the same piece of geography, and it was, in a way that neither would have described in those terms, the most honest engagement either of them had been in. Not a fight about winning, but a fight about time, about which will was going to occupy which 11 seconds. Sanji came over the cliff from the harbor side and hit Sakazuki from his left with a kick wrapped in hockey so dense it was visible as a black corona, aimed precisely at the Admiral's center of mass. It didn't drop Sakazuki. Nothing was going to drop Sakazuki with one kick. But it moved him, and moving him moved the magma barrier's coverage point, and Zoro cut the gap that opened in the barrier, and the path to the interior remained open by a margin of seconds in geometry. Sakazuki looked at Sanji. "Cook," he said. "Heard you learned my captain's name today," Sanji said. His voice was completely flat. "My captain's name was Monkey D. Luffy, and he was the freest person who ever lived, and you killed him, and I want you to know that I know that, and I remember it, and this kick is specifically about that." He was already moving. Presentation. The kick connected at a different angle, and Sakazuki's response was immediate and total, and the exchange that followed moved so fast that the Marines watching from the harbor entrance ships couldn't fully track it. Only the results were visible: the impact craters in the cliff face, the magma splashes that went wide, Sanji moving through them with the specific quality of motion that his fighting had when he was entirely committed. It still wasn't enough to stop Sakazuki. But it was enough to take his attention for 90 seconds. 90 seconds was what they needed. The tower spoke. It happened with the specific non-drama of something that has been designed by very good engineers. No build-up, no ceremony. Frankie completed the activation sequence. Law maintained the initiation frequency for one final sustained output. The encoding in Robin's hands reached the transfer threshold. And the tower spoke. The signal went out across the Grand Line and then beyond it, riding the atmospheric conductivity of the world's most electrically charged ocean and then jumping the brakes into the calmer seas beyond, reaching the relay networks that the Den Mushi infrastructure had spent 100 years building without knowing what it would one day carry. Every receiver on every ocean got the same thing at the same moment: the voice of Laugh Tale's ancient archive, speaking in the language of the present through the translation protocol the ancient kingdom had built for exactly this, delivering the complete unedited truth of the void century in the clear and direct language of people who had known they were writing for the future, and had wanted the future to actually understand. The names of the founding families of the world government, and what they had done. The nature of the celestial dragons, their actual origins, the specific crimes of the original alliance that had been written out of the surviving record. The ancient kingdom, what it had been, what it had believed, why it had been destroyed. The will of D, what it meant, where it came from, why the name had survived 8 centuries of targeted suppression. And at the end, the message: we believed in the next age. We have always believed in it. It took 11 minutes to transmit in full. During those 11 minutes, on every ocean, in every port, on every ship with a receiver, people stopped what they were doing and listened. Marine admirals listened. Revolutionary Army commanders listened. Common people in port bars listened. Celestial dragons, in their sealed world of Mariehua, heard the signal hitting their receivers and had their servants turn it off, and turned it back on because they couldn't not. Because the specific quality of truth being told about you has a pull that even the most protected people in the world can't entirely resist. Sakazuki heard it. He had breached the plateau edge. He was 40 meters from the tower. He heard his own institution's founding described in the plain language of documented history. He heard the names of the first celestial dragons. He heard the truth of what the world government had been built on. He stopped. Not because he was destroyed by the information. Not because it unmade him. He stopped because he was, underneath everything, an honest man, and honest men, when they hear truth, have a moment. Even if the moment is brief. Even if what follows the moment is the decision to reject the truth, the moment itself is real. Sakazuki stood on the plateau of Laugh Tale, and had his moment. It lasted 4 seconds. Then he started forward again. Zoro was between him and the tower. "It's done," Zoro said. "The broadcast finished 2 minutes ago. Whatever you do now is about something else." Sakazuki looked at him. At the tower behind him, at Law on one knee beside it, depleted but conscious, at Frankie standing with his arms crossed and his sunglasses off, at Robin with her hands finally off the interface and her eyes on Sakazuki with the expression of a woman who has done the thing she was born to do. "What I do now," Sakazuki said, "is what I always do. My job." "Your job just changed," Zoro said. "The world knows what the job has been covering for. That changes what the job is." "No," Sakazuki said. "It doesn't." He believed it. That was the thing, he genuinely believed it. You could hear it in his voice, the complete absence of performance. The weight of conviction that was the same weight that had driven everything he'd ever done. He was not a hypocrite. He was something harder than a hypocrite. He was a man who had integrated a terrible choice into a philosophy that he lived completely. "Then we finish this," Zoro said. "Yes," Sakazuki said. We do. Law grabbed the side of the tower and pulled himself upright. He was not going to be a useful combatant for the next 4 hours, and he knew it, and he got upright anyway, because getting upright was the minimum he was going to do. Sanji appeared at Zoro's left, his jacket singed and his expression clean and simple in the way it got when everything superfluous had burned off. Together? Sanji said. Zoro looked at him. You're going to slow me down. I'm going to keep him busy on the left so you can use Enma at full draw without having to watch both sides. That's not slowing me down, Zoro admitted. No. It's not. They looked at Sakazuki. Sakazuki looked at the two of them. His magma moved. The cliff face behind him was black and molten and real. 2 of you, he said. Against 1 fleet admiral on my worst day. He paused. This is your best? No, Zoro said. He drew Enma and the blade went dark in the haki and it went deeper than anything he'd done today, deeper than the barrier cutting, deeper than the entrance engagement, down to the actual bottom of what he had. This is what we need. He moved. The plateau of Laugh-Tail shook. Birds left the treeline in every direction. The tower, finished with its work and 800 years patient, stood absolutely still. In the harbor below, Usopp watched the signal go out through his scope and saw the Den Mushi on the Sunny's railing start actually relaying the broadcast outward, as designed, as the network was built to do. He watched it, and he thought about a man who had always known the world's best stories were the true ones. He picked up his slingshot. He loaded it. He looked at the harbor entrance, at the ships that were trying to figure out their next move, and he made a face that was part fear and entirely commitment, and said, at a volume nobody could hear, "Okay." He started shooting. He was, as he was fond of noting and as was genuinely accurate, the weakest member of the Straw Hat crew physically. He was also the best shot on any ocean. He held the harbor entrance for the 11 minutes the broadcast needed and then for 12 minutes after that while the plateau fight continued, and he did it with ammunition and timing and the specific weaponized creativity of a man who had decided to be useful and was not going to stop until something made him. Nothing made him. Chopper fought too, because Chopper always fought when it mattered, and when Chopper fought with his monster point he was not the smallest member of the crew. He stood in the harbor and made himself large and he held the line and he was terrifying and he cried while he did it, which was perfectly fine, because holding the line and crying were not mutually exclusive, and never had been. Brook played. He played until the last marine ship at the entrance stopped trying to advance, and then he played because the music was still true and truth, once started, wants to complete itself. The tower stood silent. The broadcast was done. The world was different now. It hadn't caught up to being different yet. That would take days, weeks, the slow turn of populations and institutions and individuals processing what they'd heard. But different was not something you undid. Different was a door that opened in one direction. Robin stood at the tower's base and looked at the sky above Laugh-Tail and thought about O'Hara. About the library under the water. About the scholars who had burned. About a 6-year-old girl who had survived by being the smallest and fastest, and had spent 3 decades running in every direction before she finally stopped running and started choosing where to go. She had chosen here. She had gotten here. She had done the thing. She looked at the sky. The sky was blue and enormous and indifferent and beautiful and completely worth looking at. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the plateau above, where the fight was still happening, where Zoro and Sanji and Sakazuki were making the physical argument that the broadcast alone couldn't make, and she moved toward the path, because there was still more to do, and she was not the person to stand still when there was more to do. She climbed. Chapter 6. The tide turns. The fight on the plateau had remade the geography. That was the first thing Robin saw when she came up the cliff path, not the combatants, not the positions, but what the ground had become. The plateau's eastern half was black and slag-scarred, whole sections of it reshaped by the sustained magma output into something that no longer resembled the green, patient island she'd walked across an hour ago. Trees at the treeline had burned and stopped burning, and were now just shapes in the ash. The cliff edge had lost 2 large sections. The rock beneath her feet vibrated with the aftershock frequency of an exchange that was still ongoing somewhere ahead, through the smoke. She moved through it. The smoke was thick enough to navigate by, follow it toward its densest point, which was where the heat source was, which was where Sakazuki was. She heard Sanji before she saw him. Not his voice, the sound of his fighting, which had a specific acoustic signature when he was working at absolute output, the sharp crack of hockey-wrapped kicks at impact velocity, the rapid secondary concussion of his movement through the air. Precise. Fast. Coming from the left. She heard Enma on her right before she saw it either. Not a sound exactly, more a presence, the way you know a very heavy thing is near by the way the air behaves around it. She came through the last of the smoke and saw them. Sakazuki was standing in the middle of what had been the plateau's center, and was now a depression of black glass, the heat having fused the rock beneath him, and he was breathing. Actually breathing, she could see the chest movement, the effort of it, the signs of sustained output beginning to find its cost even in a man of his capacity. He was not diminished. But he was no longer at the beginning of what he had. Zoro was 15 feet away and he was bleeding from his left shoulder. The magma had gotten through, once, at a depth that was manageable but not nothing. He was moving on it without adjustment, which meant he'd assessed it as survivable and filed it and moved on, which was entirely Zoro and also periodically terrifying to witness. Enma was fully drawn, the blade running hockey at a depth that made it look like a cut in the air rather than a sword in it. Sanji was airborne to Sakazuki's left, moving in the three-dimensional pattern that made him impossible to track with a forward-facing combat focus, and the burns on his jacket said the magma had found him twice too, neither of them slowing him. 3 people fighting at the top of their capacity on a destroyed plateau, and the ground was losing. Robin assessed the situation in the 3 seconds it took her to clear the smoke. She calculated where she was useful. She moved to the right, flanking wide, and she did not announce herself. She bloomed hands across Sakazuki's back and arms, not to restrain him, because she was not under any illusion that she could hold the Fleet Admiral against his active resistance, but to read him, to feel the tension in the structure of what he was doing, the direction of his attention, the weight of his next movement. She'd been doing this in fights for years, the intelligence function that her ability provided when used carefully, not combat but information, fed in real time to the people who were fighting. She caught Zoro's eye for half a second. Her hands told her, left shoulder is the commitment point. When he goes full output, the left shoulder leads by 2 inches. His instinct is to drive with it. She showed Zoro with her own left shoulder, a micro-movement, barely visible, the kind of signal you could only read if you were looking for it. Zoro read it. He adjusted his angle by 3 degrees. He waited. Sakazuki drove left, the instinct Robin had read, and Zoro was at the terminus of the drive instead of in its path, and Enma came across at full draw, full hockey, aimed at the left side. It connected. Not a killing blow, Sakazuki had hockey of his own and it was deep and real and it held. But it connected at a depth that the Admiral actually felt, and felt was different from stopped, and what you felt you had to respond to. Sakazuki responded. He pushed the magma out as an environmental wave rather than a directional strike, the defensive option, buying space, and it cost him 2 seconds of transition. Sanji used the 2 seconds. His kick landed at the base of Sakazuki's right side with the force of someone who had been positioning for that exact angle for the last 4 minutes, waiting for the specific defensive posture that would expose it. The impact went in and through, and the shockwave that came out the other side of the contact cracked the glass beneath Sakazuki's feet. Sakazuki took 2 steps. He stayed upright. He turned toward Sanji. "You're better than your file indicates," he said. "Most people are better than what's written about them," Sanji said. He was already moving again. "That's kind of the problem with files." Robin bloomed hands at 3 new points. She fed Zoro the read on the right side now, the right shoulder, compensating for the impact. He was adjusting already. They were not defeating Sakazuki. She was clear-eyed about this. She had no illusions about what defeating the fleet admiral required, and she knew that what was happening on this plateau was not that. What was happening was something more specific and more important in the immediate context. They were occupying him completely, drawing every unit of his attention and capability into this space, this fight, this 30 square meters of ruined rock. While the world changed around him. The Den Den Mushi broadcast had been running for 40 minutes across every ocean when the first official response came, not from the world government, which was still in the process of deciding what its official response would be and was discovering that this was not as simple as it usually was, but from a Marine Vice Admiral stationed at a base in the North Blue who had listened to the full broadcast and had then done something no one in his position had done in living memory. He'd ordered his garrison to stand down. Not defection. Not rebellion. He'd issued a stand-down order with a written attachment that said, in the careful, precise language of a career military man trying to be honest within the constraints of his vocabulary, the basis for several standing orders in our operational mandate requires immediate review in light of new historical information. Until that review is complete, I am not authorizing actions against civilian populations or non-combatant pirates. This order supersedes all previous operational directives in those categories until further notice. He transmitted the order to his superiors, fully expecting to be immediately relieved. He'd sat at his desk and waited. No relief came. Not immediately. Because the administrative apparatus that would normally process a relief request was currently occupied with 17 other simultaneous crises generated by the broadcast, and the people who would normally handle it were currently in emergency sessions about the broadcast, and the system, Sakazuki's meticulously maintained system, was discovering that it had been built for normal operational conditions and the current conditions were not normal. By the time the relief order was processed and transmitted, 4 hours later, 3 other vice admirals had issued similar orders in similarly careful language. The fleet at Laugh-Tale's harbor entrance had received no updated orders for an hour. The senior officer on the largest ship, a rear admiral named Korvat, a man who had served for 22 years and who had listened to the full broadcast on the ship's receiver and had not spoken for 12 minutes afterward, made the decision to hold position without engagement, citing ongoing assessment of operational parameters. It was the most bureaucratic sentence he'd ever produced. It was also the most important. The ships held position. The harbor remained contested but not invaded. The fight on the plateau continued. Sabo heard the broadcast on the operational Den Den Mushi in the Revolutionary Army's vessel while simultaneously managing reports from 6 active cells, and he stopped managing the reports for the 11 minutes the broadcast ran, and when it finished he stood very still for a moment, and then he put his hand flat on the chart table and kept it there until the moment passed. Koala didn't say anything. She watched him and didn't say anything, which was what the moment required. "It worked," he said. "It worked," she confirmed. He straightened. He pulled his hand off the table. He looked at the operational map with the eyes of a man updating his model of the situation in real time. "The cells. All active. Sabaody is reporting that the marine suppression response has stopped. They're holding but not advancing. Something's changed in their orders. The broadcast changed their orders." He picked up the operational pen. The Army's visibility campaign was always the secondary objective. The broadcast was the primary. Now the visibility campaign becomes something different, not a distraction but a demonstration. Every revolutionary who came forward publicly today is now someone the world can see, in the context of a world that has just heard what the world government was built on. He looked at her. They're not criminals anymore. They're the response. There's a difference. The celestial dragons will not see the difference. The celestial dragons are not the ones the world is listening to right now. He marked 2 points on the map. Get me the status of the Laugh-Tale engagement. The Straw Hats, what's happening? Koala pulled the last known signal. The broadcast came from Laugh-Tale, which means they got there and they made it work. The Marine fleet at the harbor is holding position. She paused. Active engagement reported on the island itself. No specific details, but the Sunny and the Tang are still there, still transmitting position signals, which means the crew isn't gone or captured. Sakazuki is on the island, Sabo said. Most likely. He looked at the map. At the small mark indicating the Sunny's position at the end of the Grand Line. At the distance between that mark and every other mark on the board. At the shape of the thing, the broadcast done, the fleet stalled, the fight still ongoing, because a fight with Sakazuki was always still ongoing until it wasn't. He looked at the map for exactly 3 seconds. We moved to Laugh Tale, he said. Koala looked up. The army, the cells can hold their positions without me in the room. The army moves when the army moves. But the Straw Hat crew is at Laugh Tale fighting Sakazuki with whatever they have left after getting through the Grand Line in 9 days, and the broadcast is done, which means the fight on that plateau is about something other than what we do next. He was already moving toward the hatch. It's about whether the people who did this make it back. That's... Koala started. It's not strategy, he said. I know. It's the other thing. He looked at her with Luffy's smile, bent. Come on. She came. Fujitora felt the broadcast on his personal receiver at his desk, and he listened to every word of it with the specific quality of attention he gave things that were going to require action, and when it finished he sat with his hands on the desk and thought about choices. He'd spent his life making choices in the specific institutional mode, the mode where individual conscience was subordinate to organizational direction, where your personal judgment was a tool to be employed in service of the larger structure rather than a sovereign faculty. He'd chosen this mode deliberately. He'd built his philosophy around it. He'd blinded himself in service of a version of it. He thought about what the broadcast said about the institution he'd been serving. Not with surprise, he'd known, in the aggregate and the outline, that the world government's foundations were not clean. You didn't spend 20 years as an admiral without understanding that the structure had rooms you weren't invited into and histories that didn't appear in official records. He'd accepted this as the condition of all institutions, the cost of choosing the organizational mode. What the broadcast told him, specifically and completely and in documented detail, was that the rooms weren't incidental. They were structural. The thing in the rooms wasn't an aberration in an otherwise sound building. The rooms were load-bearing. He picked up his cane. He stood up. He walked to the communications room and he transmitted 3 messages in rapid succession. The first was to the fleet at Laugh Tale's harbor. It identified him by rank and command authority, and it said, "You are ordered to stand down from all offensive operations at the Laugh Tale harbor and island perimeter. You are ordered to render emergency aid to any personnel in distress regardless of affiliation. You are ordered to wait for further instruction. This order carries admiral-level authority. Fujitora Isho." The second was to Marine Headquarters. It was addressed to the administrative chain rather than to Sakazuki, because Sakazuki was on Laugh Tale and not at his desk. It said, "I am formally resigning my commission as Admiral of the Marine Corps, effective immediately, with full acknowledgement of the implications and without request for processing delay. I will submit complete documentation through standard channels when circumstances permit. My actions from this moment are my own. Isho." The third message was to a Den Mushi address he'd kept in his memory for 7 months, never transmitted to. It was short. It said, "Dragon, I believe we need to talk. I am no longer an obstacle. Isho." He sent all 3. He stood in the communications room for a moment. He thought about whether he felt different. He felt lighter. That was unexpected. He'd anticipated feeling unweird, the specific vertigo of a man who has removed the structure he organized his life around. Instead, he felt what he recognized, after a moment, as relief. The relief of a man who has been maintaining a position that required a great deal of effort to maintain, and has finally set it down. He went back to his quarters. He got his coat, not the Marine Admiral coat, which he left on the chair. His own coat, the one he'd owned before the commission, the one he'd worn on the journey that had eventually brought him to Sakazuki's attention. He put it on. He picked up his cane. He went to find a ship going south toward the Grand Line. The plateau fight had been running for 23 minutes and Sakazuki was still standing, and so were Zoro and Sanji, and that was a true statement about all three of them, and what they were made of. Zoro's left shoulder had stopped bleeding because there was simply no more blood to spare for it, and his body had made the pragmatic decision to divert resources. He was running on something below the level of thought, in the place where training went when the thinking parts of the brain ran out of useful things to contribute, the place where the body just did what it had been taught to do, and the teaching held because it was complete and deep and had been driven in 3 years of genuine suffering. 3 swords. Full hockey. Enma drawing hard. He was giving it everything. Sanji was giving it everything. His legs were the instrument, and the instrument was performing at the level of something that had been built from the ground up for exactly this kind of sustained extreme use. And the burns on his jacket, and the cut above his eye said the cost was real, but the performing continued. Robin had stopped being a passive intelligence function 4 minutes in. She was active now, hands blooming at Sakazuki's periphery at angles that weren't about restraint but about interruption, the fraction of a second delays that the blooming created in his movement tracking, small interferences that on any other opponent would be distracting and on Sakazuki were something slightly less than that but not nothing. Not nothing was what they had. They were working with not nothing and they were making it count. Sakazuki looked at them, genuinely looked, the way he looked at things that required honest assessment, and he said nothing, and he fought, and the fight was real and the plateau kept taking the damage of it. Then Chopper came over the cliff edge. Monster point. Full output. The size of the transformation always startled even the people who knew it was coming. Chopper became a thing of scale, large enough that his footstep on the plateau's edge cracked what was left of the rock there. His eyes red and focused and completely committed. Sakazuki looked at him. Monster, Sakazuki said. Informational. Adjusting. Chopper said nothing. He moved. Monster point Chopper at full output was a different category of physical force than what had been on the plateau before him, and the addition of it changed the geometry of the engagement completely. Sakazuki had to redistribute. He was fighting 4 significant threats across the full radius of his position, which meant he couldn't maintain the sustained environmental magma output he'd been using as his defensive base because the processing requirement for tracking 4 simultaneous high-speed threats was incompatible with it. He went direct. All 4 of them felt what direct meant. It was the version of Sakazuki that the intelligence profiles described as the reason people who worked for him both trusted him completely and were afraid of him. The version that had burned Ace's life out of him on the ground at Marineford and had never lost a night's sleep over it because it was right. It was always right. The rightness was the organizing principle of everything. He was extraordinary. He was the most powerful human being any of them had physically encountered. He hit Chopper with the direct magma at a depth that sent the large form skidding back 20 feet across the plateau's ruined surface. He turned toward Zoro. Zoro met him. What happened in the next 40 seconds would be the part that Usopp, when he told this story later, and he told it many times, improving it correctly, adding the light and the sound and the scale it deserved, found the hardest to put into words. Because the hardest things to put into words are the ones where the meaning is entirely in the physical, in the contact, in the exchange, in the way 2 things meet each other at their full extension and the meeting says something that language can only point at from a distance. Zoro hit Sakazuki with everything he had. Enma at full draw, full hockey, both other blades contributing everything they could contribute, the complete output of a man who was the world's best swordsman in the making and knew it, and was doing it right now. Sakazuki matched it. Hockey against hockey. Magma against black blade. Will against will. The plateau's remaining center section went into the ground. Both of them were still standing. Sakazuki had a cut, a real one, along his left side where Enma had finally gotten through at the depth required, where the blade had found the seam between the hockey and made it count. It was bleeding. It was significant. Sakazuki looked at the cut. He looked at Zoro. "You cut me," he said. "Yeah," Zoro said. He was breathing hard. Genuinely hard, now, in the honest way of someone who had given the actual bottom of what they had and was operating on the thing below the bottom, which exists but costs more than everything above it. I told you! Sakazuki stood with the cut and looked at the 4 people on the plateau, Zoro and Sanji, Robin recovering her position, Chopper getting back to his feet and reorganizing the monster point's mass. He looked at the tower, silent now, its work complete. He looked at the sky above Laugh Tale. He thought about the broadcast. About the truth of what his institution had been built on. About the 4 seconds on this plateau when he'd heard it and stopped. He thought about what he believed and whether what he believed could survive the truth of what he'd heard. It could. He decided that it could. The world government's foundations were what they were. He hadn't built them, he'd inherited them, and what he built on top of them was his, and it was right, and the rightness of it didn't depend on the cleanliness of the original structure. You built what you built in the world that existed. The alternative, the chaos of what these people represented, the open sea, the pirate flag, the freedom without order, was worse. It was always worse. He believed this. He looked at Zoro and he believed this. Then we're not finished, he said. No, Zoro said. I want you to understand, Sakazuki said, and his voice had the quality it always had, the quality Robin had noted from the beginning, not theatrical, just completely sincere, the voice of a man who had never needed performance because he meant every word. I am not going to stop. What you've done today, the broadcast, the information, the disruption of the secondary operations, none of it changes my objective. The world needs order. I am going to provide it. And I am going to do that regardless of what you do next. Zoro looked at him. I believe you, Zoro said. Sakazuki seemed to receive this as expected. And I'm going to stop you, Zoro said. Not today. Today I ran out of today. He lowered Enma slightly, not sheathing it, not surrendering it, just acknowledging the arithmetic of where they were. But the world just heard the truth about what you're protecting. And the world is going to decide what it wants to do with that. And what it decides is going to make your job a lot harder than it's been. He looked at the fleet admiral with the direct, uncomplicated honesty of a man who meant every word he said and didn't need to dress any of them up. You're not done. Neither am I. And the next time we do this, I'll have more than today. Sakazuki looked at him for a long moment. The cut along his left side was doing what cuts do. He was assessing the tactical position, the plateau, the ships in the harbor, the operational state of the engagement. Then something happened that nobody on the plateau had anticipated. From below the harbor, a signal went up, not a weapon, not a combat signal. A den mushi relay, broadcast at short range, carrying a frequency identification code that Sakazuki's military-trained recognition snapped to immediately. It was Fujitora's communication code. But the message was not from Fujitora. It was a relay, Fujitora's code carrying a message from the Revolutionary Army's vessel, which had apparently entered the harbor's outer approaches sometime in the last 20 minutes. The message was from Sabo. It came through on every receiver in the harbor simultaneously, on the marine ships, on the Sunny, on the Polar Tang, up the cliff to the plateau where Sakazuki and 4 battered fighters stood in the remains of a morning's work. This is Commander Sabo of the Revolutionary Army. The following vessels are currently entering the Laugh Tale Harbor approach: Revolutionary Army Command Vessel Morn's Light, and 17 Allied ships carrying combined forces of the Army's Central Command. We are not here to engage the Marine Fleet. We are here to collect our allies. I would recommend the Harbor Fleet consider the arithmetic of the situation they are currently in before deciding their response. The broadcast has reached every ocean. The world is listening. Whatever happens at Laugh Tale in the next 30 minutes will be heard by that same world. Choose carefully. Sabo. A pause. And then, in a different register, not the official command voice but the real one underneath it, warm and slightly raw and completely genuine: Straw Hats. I'm here. Hold on. On the plateau, Zoro heard it through the den mushi in Robin's coat and said nothing. Sakazuki heard it, and his jaw tightened and his calculation updated. 17 additional ships. Revolutionary Army Central Command. The Marine fleet already in positional disarray. The cut in his side. The 4 people in front of him, depleted but not finished, not the kind of people who finished until they were physically unable to continue, which he could see they were not quite at yet. And behind it all, the broadcast. Done. Complete. Already reaching the world's ears, already beginning to work in the slow and irreversible way that truth worked in populations. He was Sakazuki. He did not make emotional decisions. He made strategic ones. The strategic decision, assessed honestly, was this: the battle of Laugh Tale was over. Not because he had lost, he had not lost, not by the metric he used to evaluate loss, which was whether the objective had been fully achieved. The objective had not been fully achieved. The straw hats were alive and the broadcast was done and the Revolutionary Army was arriving. But continuing the engagement in these conditions would cost resources he needed for what came next, and what came next was more important than what was happening right now. The fight here was not the war. The fight here was a day in the war. He looked at Zoro. "Rorinoa," he said. "Still here," Zoro said. "You said the next time we do this you'll have more than today." "Yeah. So will I," Sakazuki said. He turned. He walked toward the cliff edge. He built a platform of solidified magma below it, and he stepped off the plateau and descended toward the harbor without looking back, and his posture was what it always was, straight, deliberate, carrying the weight of what he intended without performance. And he reached his ship, and the fleet consolidated around him, and they moved north out of the harbor in the particular formation of a force that was repositioning rather than retreating, which was a distinction Sakazuki clearly considered important enough to execute with precision. The harbor entrance cleared. The Revolutionary Army's ships came in. Sabo came up the cliff path at a speed that suggested he'd been running since the ship anchored, which he had. He came through the plateau smoke and stopped at the edge of what the plateau had become and looked at the 4 people standing in it. Zoro. Sanji. Robin. Chopper, Monster Point receding now, shrinking back to his ordinary form, sitting down heavily because the transition took something out of him. Sabo looked at all of them. At the tower, standing quiet and complete. At the destroyed rock. At the sky. He looked at Zoro specifically, for a long moment, and Zoro looked back, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't a shape of words for it. The specific thing between a man carrying his brother's dream forward and the man whose brother had shared that dream most completely, standing in the place where the dream's largest piece had just been done. Sabo put his hand out. A specific gesture, not a handshake, not a formal thing. Just his hand open, in the space between them. Zoro looked at the hand. He took it. They held the grip for 3 seconds. "Thank you," Sabo said. His voice was the real voice, not the commander's. "Don't thank me," Zoro said. "Just make sure the army does its part." Sabo almost laughed. "Almost. The army's doing its part." Koala appeared behind him, assessed the plateau damage with the systematic efficiency of a former Marine who processed environments automatically, looked at Chopper, and went to him immediately with the medical instinct that overrode everything else. Chopper looked at her supplies and looked at his, and they started working together without introduction because both of them were the kind of people who understood that the work was its own introduction. Sanji sat down on a piece of what had been cliff edge and lit a cigarette, and held it there without smoking it, looking at the horizon where Sakazuki's fleet was becoming distant. Robin sat beside the tower's base. She put her hand against the stone, flat-palmed. She held it there for a moment, some kind of communication, or gratitude, or the gesture of one person who had dedicated their life to information acknowledging another structure that had done the same for 800 years. She took her hand away. She stood up. "We need to go," she said. Not urgently. Informing. "I know," Nami said. She'd come up the path behind Sabo, because Nami was going to be on whatever cliff or plateau contained the people she was responsible for navigating. That was not negotiable. She looked at the group. She did her count, the automatic navigator's inventory of every person she was responsible for, confirmed present, confirmed functional or being made functional. Her eyes stopped on Zoro's shoulder for a fraction of a second. He met her eyes. "Chopper will look at it," he said. "I know he will," she said. "Because I'm going to tell him to." "You don't have to tell him. He already knows." "I know." She looked at the horizon. "Sakazuki isn't done." "No. He's going back to Marineford to rebuild. The fleet, the secondary operations, all of it." She had her chart in her hand, which she'd brought up the cliff because she was Nami, and she didn't go anywhere without her tools. "He'll be smarter next time. Faster." "Yeah," Zoro said. "So will we." She looked at him directly, in the way she sometimes did that bypassed the navigator and was just Nami, the woman from Kokoyashi who had learned to read water before she learned to read maps, who had survived things that should have finished her by being smarter and faster and more stubborn than everything she ran into. "And the time after that?" "And the time after that," Zoro said. "Until it's done." She held his look for a moment. She nodded once, the specific decisive nod. She unrolled the chart. She looked at the route back. "We sail in an hour," she said. "Sabo's fleet gives us cover for the northern exit. After that we split, the Tang goes its own way, we go ours. The world is going to be different for the next few weeks, and I need us in a position to respond to what it becomes." "Where do we go?" Usopp asked. He'd come up the cliff path at some point, breathing harder than everyone else but present, slingshot over his shoulder, absolutely not going to be the only one who stayed on the ship. Nami looked at the chart. She looked at the ocean around Laugh Tale, at the routes available, at the state of the world as she understood it from the broadcasts and reports she'd been tracking through the entire engagement. She thought about what the world needed, not from its heroes but from the people who showed up. "Everywhere," she said. "We go everywhere." They left Laugh Tale as the afternoon was softening into evening, the sunny cutting north through the Grand Line with the Revolutionary Army ships spread wide on either side, the polar Tang running parallel at a distance that was close enough for communication and far enough to be operationally independent, which was exactly how Law preferred it. The Grand Line did what the Grand Line did, whether that changed like a personality, currents that disagreed with each other, the general magnificent hostility of the world's most extreme ocean. The Sunny moved through it the way she always moved through it, with full sails and a heading that Nami held with both hands on the wheel and didn't take her eyes off. Chopper had fixed Zoro's shoulder in the way that Chopper fixed things, which was to say thoroughly and while explaining in medical detail what he was doing and what the structure of the injury was, in a tone that was both professionally interested and personally exasperated. Zoro had sat still for it, which was his contribution to the process. Sanji had gone to the galley. He'd been in there for 40 minutes, and the smell coming out was doing something to the mood of the entire ship that no other mechanism available to them could have done. Not just food, Sanji food, which was the specific thing that Sanji made when the people he was feeding needed more than nutrition. Something that had care in its chemistry. When it came out, they ate on the main deck because the main deck was where they needed to be, open sky, open sea, the Grand Line doing its enormous thing around them. Brook played while they ate, something with energy this time, something moving forward. Frankie had put the straw hat Jolly Roger back up at the top of the mast. It had been there the whole time, but he'd gone up after the plateau and retied it, tighter, in the specific way of a man who wanted it to be clear it was staying there. The flag moved in the evening wind. The same flag. The same colors. The same grinning skull with the straw hat sitting at its angle. Nobody said it. Nobody needed to. The world's response to the broadcast came in waves. The first wave was confusion, the instinctive recoil of populations encountering information that contradicted the foundational story they'd been given, the cognitive work of reconciling new truth with old assumption. This happened everywhere, simultaneously, and it looked different depending on where you were, and what you'd already suspected and how much the old story had served you. The second wave was anger. This was louder and more visible, and it ran in both directions, anger at the world government from populations that had lived under its thumb and now had the documentary framework to name what they'd always felt, and anger at the broadcast itself from people whose identity was bound to the institution, who experienced the truth as an attack rather than a correction. The third wave was something quieter and more durable. It was the wave of people who had listened to the broadcast and then looked at the people around them and had a conversation, a real one, without a party line or an official frame, about what they wanted the world to be. These conversations happened in marine barracks and pirate ship galleys and island market squares and celestial dragon antechambers and revolutionary army command rooms and everywhere that people had the physical proximity and the available moment to talk honestly. Not all of them arrived at the same conclusion. That was the point. They weren't supposed to. The ancient kingdom hadn't built the transmission tower to tell the world what to decide. They'd built it to give the world the information required to actually decide. Lieutenant Hannah Cease, the Marine guard from the Marineford scaffold, the one who had heard nobody can execute a want, was in her barracks when the broadcast ran. She listened to all of it. She sat with it for 2 days. Then she submitted a transfer request to a unit whose function was civilian aid and disaster response rather than combat enforcement, citing, in the careful language that the system required, a reassessment of where her skills were most useful. The request was approved in the administrative chaos following the broadcast, partly because approvals were happening without the usual careful scrutiny, and partly because her record was excellent and her transfer was low profile and nobody in the current administrative emergency had the bandwidth to examine low profile transfers. She reported to her new unit, and she did her job. She was good at her job. She was good at all of her jobs. Captain Trees, her former commanding officer, received the transfer notice and filed it without comment. He had his own conversations happening, his own reckoning with what the broadcast had told him. He was not yet sure where those conversations were going to end. But he was having them, which was a different state from the one he'd been in a week ago, and different was where things began. Rear Admiral Corvat, on the largest ship of the Laugh-Tail fleet, wrote a report to Marine headquarters that was honest in a way that Rear Admiral reports rarely were. He described what had happened at Laugh-Tail accurately and completely, including the decision to hold position, including the content of the broadcast he'd heard, including his assessment that the Straw Hat crew had not behaved as pirates in the traditional operational sense but as something the current classification system didn't have a category for. He submitted the report knowing it might end his career and submitted it anyway, because he was 22 years into the Marines, because he had believed in the idea of it, and the idea required honesty to survive. Katakuri, from the window of the Whole Cake Island ramparts, watched the Marine fleet that had been approaching Todo Land's outer islands reverse course and head north at speed. He watched them until they were gone. Then he turned around and went to find his siblings, because there was an enormous amount of work to be done rebuilding something that was genuinely his now, in a way it had only been partially his before. His mother was gone. The structure she'd built was his. He was going to build it differently. Not because he decided to be a different person but because the circumstances required different decisions, and Katakuri had always been good at making the decision the circumstances actually required rather than the one he'd already made. He found Perispero first, because Perispero was the oldest and the most volatile and the most likely to make an immediately catastrophic choice if left unsupervised. He found him standing in the corridor outside the communications room, listening to the broadcast relay on a Den Mushi. Perispero looked at him when the relay finished. "The world government," Perispero said slowly, in the tone of a man arriving at a conclusion he'd rather not have arrived at, "is not going to be what it was." "No," Katakuri said. "And the balance of power is different now." "Yes." Perispero stood with this. "What do we do?" Katakuri looked at him. "We do what we've always done. We make Todo Land strong. We protect our people." He paused. "And we don't make the same enemies twice." Perispero thought about this. "And the Straw Hats?" Katakuri turned and started walking down the corridor. "We'll see," he said. Perispero considered this and found it, unexpectedly, an acceptable answer. On the sunny, 3 days north of Laugh Tale, Zoro was on night watch again. The stars were the same. The Grand Line's weather had settled into one of its temporary cooperations, the kind that lasted long enough to feel like permission before becoming something else. The water was dark and deep and moving in its permanent directions beneath the sunny's passage. Zoro stood at the bow and looked at the ocean ahead of them. Sakazuki was out there. Still standing, still absolute, still convinced of the rightness of the architecture he'd spent his life building. The secondary operations would resume. The confrontation that had been deferred on the plateau would happen again, elsewhere, on terms that both of them would arrive at better prepared. The world the broadcast had started changing would keep changing, slowly, in the way large things changed, not all at once but by degrees, each degree permanent. None of it was finished. He knew that. He wasn't looking for finished. He was looking at the ocean ahead of them. The thing he'd been not thinking about since Briar Island, since the Den Den Mushi in his pocket had said the words execution and Marineford and Luffy in a single sentence, that thing was still there. It was always going to be there. That was something he'd arrived at on the plateau, in one of the moments between exchanges when the body was doing what it was trained to do and the mind had a fraction of a second of actual space. The thing didn't go away. You didn't resolve grief by resolution. You resolved it by carrying it correctly, not as a weight that bent you forward, but as a thing that moved with you, that became part of the motion rather than a resistance to it. He thought about the sky over Marineford, the particular blue of early morning, the way Luffy had looked at it. He thought about what Luffy had said to the Marine Guard. The thing about wants. The thing about the sea. You can't make the sea quiet. The surface could go smooth for a while, and then something moved underneath. Something was moving underneath. He could feel it in the way the ocean moved against the sunny's hull, not a metaphor, an actual physical fact. The currents at depth were doing something different from what they'd been doing a week ago. Nami had told him what that meant, navigationally. He was using it as something else. The world was different. He was different. The crew was different, in the specific way of people who had passed through something enormous, and come out the other side not unchanged but continuous, still themselves, just with more of what they'd already been. He put his hand on Enda's hilt. Not the combat grip. Just the resting contact, the way you touch something that's yours. We go and fix it. Simple. Obvious. Luffy's. He looked at the ocean ahead. At the dark water and the stars above it, and the route that Nami had plotted through all of it, specific and true, aligned through the uncertainty of what was coming. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The saying part had been done, on the deck at Briar, on the plateau at Laugh Tale, in the grip between him and Sabo that had meant something neither of them had tried to put words to. The doing part was what was left. He watched the ocean. The sunny moved through it. The flag at the top of the mast moved in the night wind, the grinning skull with the straw hat at its angle, visible to the sea and the sky and anyone out there in the dark who needed to know that someone was still sailing. Still here. Still moving. The Grand Line opened in front of them, enormous and unreasonable and completely itself, and the crew of the Thousand Sunny went into it the way they always went into everything, together, without stopping, with full sails and the specific stubborn velocity of people who had decided where they were going and had no intention of being anywhere else. The night held them. The stars watched. The ocean received them and carried them forward in the direction they'd chosen, the way the ocean carries everything that has the sense to move with it rather than against it. The story wasn't finished. It was never finished. That was the whole point.